Richard Milhouse Nixon grew up in small-town California, where, as a child, he developed a fighting spirit and a drive to excel. At 10, Nixon told his mother he wanted to become, quote, an honest lawyer who can't be bought by crooks. But an unfolding political scandal known as Watergate would much later shatter his reputation, and in August of 1974, yield the only presidential resignation in American history. He was the second of 5 children born in a timber frame home his father built from a kit. Frank Nixon ran a market in Whittier, California, and had liked the Republican Party since the day President McKinley had passed by and complimented him on his horse. Nixon's mother, Hannah, was a Quaker and wanted her son to become a missionary. Nixon was a dreamer who listened to train whistles at night and pictured visiting faraway places. He was 12 when his little brother Arthur died of tuberculosis, and Nixon responded by doubling up his efforts to succeed and make his parents proud. He graduated from Whittier College in 1934 and Duke University Law School in 1937. Students elected him class president, but also called him a gloomy Gus, thanks to his serious disposition. He fell in love at first sight with former movie extra and USC graduate Pat Ryan, and proposed shortly after meeting her. I thought he was nuts or something, Mrs. Nixon later recalled. Undeterred, he courted her persistently for 2 years, and they married in June of 1940. After a stint in the Navy during World War II, Nixon entered politics, winning a House seat at age 33 in 1946. As a congressman, Nixon made a name for himself investigating charges of communist infiltration in the federal government. Among the accused was a former State Department official named Alger Hiss. The case made Nixon famous. He won a Senate seat 4 years later at age 37 and was soon once again in the national spotlight. Not long after being selected as Dwight Eisenhower's running mate in 1952, Nixon was accused of maintaining a secret slush fund. He went on television to explain the case to the nation. The Checker speech, named after Nixon's reference to his daughter's Cocker Spaniel, repaired his reputation, and Nixon stayed on the ticket, going on to serve as Eisenhower's vice president for 2 terms. He ran for president himself in 1960, losing to John F. Kennedy by the narrowest of margins. He lost a governor's race 2 years later, but regrouped to launch another presidential bid in 1968, when he defeated challenger Hubert Humphrey by less than 1% of the popular vote. He was a shy and reserved commander-in-chief. As president, Nixon preferred spending time alone thinking, or hashing out ideas with an advisor. Few people would ever know him well. His chief of staff called him inexplicable, strange, and hard to understand. "I can't really let my hair down with anyone," Nixon once said, "not even with my family." In 1972, Nixon became the first president to visit communist China, and that same year traveled to Moscow to help normalize relations with the Soviet Union. A strong economy and progressive domestic agenda helped him win public approval, and he was re-elected in 1972, that time by a landslide. The triumph, however, was short-lived. The previous summer, 5 men and their 2 handlers working for the Committee to Re-elect the President had been charged with burglarizing the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate apartment complex in Washington, D.C. Initially described by the White House as a third-rate burglary, the incident gave way to a series of revelations that eventually implicated the president in a cover-up. Nixon didn't want to resign. In his own words, he'd wanted to end his career, quote, as a fighter, the way it had begun. Aides, however, persuaded him otherwise, and he left office on August 9, 1974. Pardoned a month later by his successor, Gerald Ford, Nixon retired to California before moving to the East Coast. He traveled extensively, often meeting with foreign dignitaries, and wrote 9 best-selling books. He died April 22, 1994, at age 81.
To have served in this office is to have felt a very personal sense of kinship with each and every American. In leaving it, I do so with this prayer. May God's grace be with you in all the days ahead.
Today, the American President series brings you to Yorba Linda, California, site of the Nixon Library. John Taylor, Executive Director of the library. Why Yorba Linda?
Soon after the turn of the century, the President's father, Frank Nixon, bought a 13-acre citrus farm in Yorba Linda. He ordered a kit house and built it in 1912, bringing his wife, Hannah Nixon, here and their family. The future president was born in 1913 and decided in the 1980s he wanted his library established in the shadow of the little White House.
And John Taylor and I are inside the little White House, right in front of the bed where Richard Nixon was born. Mr. Taylor, what else about this house, as you've preserved it, is important to know to understand Richard Nixon?
The problem for any historical site is how to deal with young people who don't remember the president before the current one. So what we try to do with the president's birthplace is underscore the extent to which kids can learn from this place that everything their parents tell them to do and their guardians tell them to do is indispensable to the course of their future lives, which is why they have to brush their teeth and go to bed when they're told. Everything Richard Nixon needed to deal with life's disappointments and life's triumphs and all the opportunities of public life, he took out of this house when he was 6. He was born in this bed on a morning in January 9th, 1913, a very cold morning in Yorba Linda, the coldest then on record. Historians differ over whether the doctor got here in time or whether he was delivered by a midwife. Now, there are 5 key influences on Richard Nixon, all formative by the time of his early boyhood, that you can see in the artifacts in this house, almost all of which, incidentally, were used by the Nixon family at the time they lived here. This 120-year-old piano he sat down when he was a little boy, picked out a Christmas carol by ear, soon took lessons and was very promising as a student, played several other instruments as well, including the violin and the clarinet. Never got too far beyond the intermediate and early advanced level as a pianist, but took enormous pleasure and joy and comfort and inspiration from music the rest of his life. On the wall, you can see a composite photo of all 5 Nixon boys taken around the age of 3. Harold, Richard, Arthur, Donald, and Edward. Edward is still alive, living in the Seattle area as a trustee of this foundation. And this is just a small symbol of the important role that family always played in Richard Nixon's life, both as a child in this house, later in Whittier, and as a father and a parent himself. Family always sustained him and animated him and comforted him. Around the dining room table, the third important influence on him, it's hard to imagine a more remote place in America just after the turn of the century than Yorba Linda. It was about as far away from the center of economic and political power and influence in this country as it was possible to be. But Richard Nixon soon learned that there was a world beyond Yorba Linda where decisions were made in many capitals, including our own, that would have an impact on his life and the life of his family and his friends. And over this dining room table there would be many discussions, often led by his politically active and aware father Frank, about what was going on in the world, particularly the events of World War I and the League of Nations and the events soon thereafter. A fourth important influence on the future president was spirituality. President Nixon's mother was a Quaker, his father was a Methodist, and the president would often joke that when his parents wed, they compromised and his father became a Quaker. Quakers talked to God quietly and privately, and several times a day, Mrs. Nixon would go into her sewing room, where there's still a Singer sewing machine, and pray privately. The family used the Quaker plain speech in this house. And until the last weeks of his life, Richard Nixon was continuing his reading in philosophy and theology. He was a little bit of a skeptic in terms of his theology as a high school student and a college student. But his spirituality, though an intensely private spirituality, sustained him throughout his life. Finally, the fifth and perhaps most decisive influence that Richard Nixon took away from this house was a profound sense of stick-to-itiveness. There has rarely been a successful politician who hasn't been an overachiever, who hasn't been several steps ahead of the competition. And a good symbol of that is this fireplace that was built by Frank Nixon. He built other fireplaces in the Yorba Linda neighborhood as well. And by the light of this fire, at 5 in the morning on school mornings, Richard Nixon would frequently be lying in front of the fire, putting the finishing touches on his homework, while his mother baked and cooked in the kitchen a few steps away.
Well, John Taylor, you and I are going to walk out the front door of this to the garden outside where our set is for our program on Richard Nixon. And we are going to join Dr. Melvin Small, who is a historian and Nixon biographer, who will be with us for our program. Dr. Small, let me ask you, as a historian, why did Richard Nixon interest you?
He interested me because he is perhaps the most controversial president in our history. In fact, he's recently won a poll as the most controversial. And it's a real challenge for a historian who's lived through his era to try to write a balanced and fair analysis of his presidency.
And how, in the end, do you come down in your analysis of him? What's your view overall?
Well, I discovered, among other things, that he was a lot smarter, more intellectually heavy than I thought, that he was multidimensional, much more complex a person than I thought of when I was a mere citizen of the country as a Democrat, as many American historians are in scholarly pursuits. He much more complicated, much more fascinating, and surprisingly, and your guest the next hour will say this, Joan Hough, I conclude that he was, at least domestically, the last liberal president, which astounds my colleagues.
We will be here for the next 3 hours, and what makes our American President Series work is your participation. Our phone lines are open for your questions and comments about the presidency of Richard M. Nixon, and here's how you participate. If you live in the eastern half of the United States, dial 202-624-1111. If you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, including Californians, where we are today, 202-624-1115 is the number that you dial. We'll take your telephone calls for the next 3 hours as we look at the Nixon Library, see some archival footage, and learn more about people who have studied him and, in fact, known him. That includes you. When did you meet Richard Nixon?
In 1979 at his home in San Clemente when I was a political science undergraduate at the University of California at San Diego.
What can you tell us of your personal knowledge of the man?
Well, I worked for him for a total of 15 years, from that moment until his death in 1994. And I spent 6 years as his administrative assistant and 10 years in his office in New York and New Jersey. And I came to admire and care about him enormously, both as a result of learning from him and from others about his accomplishments as a president, and by also observing him as a man and as a father, and as someone who had an extraordinary will to continue to have an impact on the course of events, aware that his work as a former president would at best have a marginal impact on his historic standing. He knew that that would be the work of historians who would work long after he had passed because of the passions of the era in which he governed. But he simply wanted to have an impact on the course of events because it was part of the core of his being to do so. Had he not resigned, had he left office under normal circumstances in 1977, Richard Nixon probably would have had a former presidency much like he had in reality, advising all of his successors as president, traveling the world, writing books, speaking out when he thought it was appropriate, principally on foreign policy. So I came to respect him, admire, and care about him both as a man and as a statesman.
Melvin Small, your book, which I've got here, I want to show folks what it looks like, just came out in September, and it's called The Presidency of Richard Nixon. It's part of the University of Kansas American Presidents Series. And I wanted to ask you, you'd say in the beginning that you can look at subjects two ways. One is a chronological view of their life, one is a topical. You've chosen the topical. Nonetheless, what about this young Richard Nixon led him to a life of public service?
That's the question that I've been asked a lot, and why does anybody who's 9, 10, 11, 12, getting into junior and high school, why does anyone decide they want to be a politician? For one thing, he was a student leader and seemed to be respected by the folks around him. He was smart, a good speaker, and for all we know, that's how these kinds of activities begin in your later life. I leave it to the psychobiographers to explain, not just Richard Nixon, but why would anyone want to get into that kind of hurly-burly?
What particular attributes did he have that made him a good politician, and what characteristics might have worked against him?
He had a wonderful memory. He had a photographic memory. And one of his colleagues, Bryce Harlow, said he was an ambulatory computer. And this is at a very young age. He was able to memorize most of his speeches and make them look like he was speaking spontaneously. He rarely forgot a county or an election total from the previous election cycle. That he was very good at. He was an intellectual for a politician and admired for his intellect. I've come to admire him later on now for his intellect, and that helped. Intellectuality, a good feeling for American history, and sensitivity towards the American political scene, particularly the lot of the average American.
First call on Richard Nixon is from Springfield, New Jersey. You're on the air.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Lewis, and I was wondering, when you think of Nixon, what do you...
I am not hearing the telephone call.
Hello?
While we get that fixed, I'm sorry, caller, I can't hear you. So let me turn to John Taylor. Why don't you tell us a little bit about his very first campaign?
Well, he was running against a 10-year incumbent in the old 12th Congressional District, which stretched all the way from Orange County halfway up Mount Wilson in the San Gabriel Valley. It was an enormous slice of working class and middle class, and in some cases upper middle class Southern California. And Voorhees was very attached to the New Deal movement, the labor movement, and Richard Nixon was a young politician who had come back from service in World War II, concerned that wartime economic controls would persist, and there was some such as Eleanor Roosevelt who insisted that they should, and who wanted to make sure that the generation that had fought for freedom in the Pacific and Europe would have the opportunity to reap the rewards of economic growth and freedom in the United States. So it was an ideologically charged campaign, essentially a campaign between two visions of government, one offered by a New Deal Democrat with close ties to the labor movement, and another by a veteran who had just come back and was promoting a new muscular kind of republicanism. And Richard Nixon won in the 12th District by a substantial margin and went to Congress for 2 terms, later running for the Senate in 1950.
What do those first campaigns shape the rest of his runs for office? Did he take lessons away from them?
Well, he always showed a knack for politics as a matter both of tactics and of inspiring voters, and also of public relations. And he was a very vigorous campaigner, and had a knack for finding issues that would be provocative to people and that would inspire people, and it was a knack he showed throughout his public life. His first campaign did not seem to him and to others at the time to have been particularly controversial, but later, particularly after the Hiss case, when he became a politician about whom people began to argue on the national level, again because of these residual post-World War II and growing Cold War tensions in American politics, people remembered the campaign against Jerry Voorhees as being a far more controversial one than it was. He went to Congress in 1947, thought of as one of a new, very ambitious and very visionary brand of politician who had come back from war, and only after the Hiss case did he become a more controversial figure.
Let's try that telephone call again. Springfield, are you still there?
Hi, my name is Jennifer Lewis, and I was wondering, when you think of Nixon, what do you think was the most influential difference that he accomplished in the society?
Dr. Small?
Yeah, I think you'd have to point to foreign policy, not all of it. I take issue with a lot of his third world activities, but certainly the opening to China in 1972, and even, although it's much criticized later, the détente with the Soviet Union, which disappeared a bit in the late 1970s, reappears in the mid-80s. I don't think we could have gotten to the mid-80s without Nixon's détente in the early 70s.
Dr. Small is based at Wayne State University near Detroit, where he is a professor of history. Next call for our 2 guests on Richard Nixon comes from Kerrville, Texas. You're on the air. Welcome.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I have a question for either Mr. Taylor or Mr. Small, and I've always been an admirer of Richard Nixon, but it's been reported that he had made a statement later in his life about something to the effect that if the president did something, it was not illegal. Could you expound on that or explain that to me, please? Thank you.
He in the interviews with David Frost in 1978, this is after he left the presidency, he suggested that national security is what the president says it is. And therefore, when the president declares a national security emergency and takes action, either without telling us or telling us, then in fact it is not illegal. And he took that position through the rest of his life, discussing some of the things that he did related to the Watergate activity.
In addition to Watergate, the issue that is indelibly matched to Watergate is the war in Vietnam. Richard Nixon was a wartime commander-in-chief who, the instant he raised his hand from the Bible on the Capitol steps on the 20th of January 1969 became responsible for the lives of 540,000 young Americans who'd been sent abroad by the two prior administrations without a particularly clear set of tactical strategic rationales, and certainly without the engagement having been properly explained to the American people. Richard Nixon's was, therefore, a wartime presidency, a war more controversial than any since the Civil War that divided the culture and that divided the country. And the particular statement made, as Dr. Small suggests, during the Frost interviews had to do in particular with the break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, which Richard Nixon did not order, but which Richard Nixon did not necessarily in retrospect think had been the most horrible thing that had happened in view of the fact that during a war, a massive leak of national security information had been made to reporters, something that probably would not have been tolerated during the Civil War or World War I or World War II, but that was tolerated and even celebrated during the Vietnam War because of the cultural divide that Vietnam caused in our country.
An event which came to be known as Watergate, and I'm sure during our program we will talk more about it. Let's go to a call next from Wampum, Pennsylvania.
Yes, a question for Dr. Small, please.
Go ahead.
I think Richard Nixon should be remembered the biggest thing that I think upset me more than anything, and I rate him as the worst president ever, is because he ran on the election as peace with honor, peace with honor. He made people seriously believe that he was going to end the Vietnam War. And being a student at Kent State University, when he said he was going to stop it, and within 2 weeks did all that massive bombing, I think it was the greatest example of mistrust given to the presidency ever. It made all the people that were either anti-war or sitting the silent majority, so many of them now went to the anti-Vietnam War movement. And I wish people just really remember that last April and May in 1970 when he promised that he was going to stop the Vietnam War. That's pretty much over. And within 2 weeks, he just escalated it like you couldn't believe, dropping all those bombs. And I just wish people remember that. Thank you.
Dr. Small?
Yeah. The questioner is talking about the invasion of Cambodia in May of 1970. President Nixon ran not with a secret plan to end the war, but he had a plan or strategy he suggested in 1968, and he told some of his colleagues the war will be over in 6 months. Well, the war was not over until January 73. If you notice, when I last responded to the foreign policy question, I did not include ending the Vietnam War, because I think the war could have been ended a lot earlier than it did, particularly considering the final way we ended the war, permitting the North Vietnamese to remain in South Vietnam, which led to, of course, the overthrow of our ally in Saigon in 1975.
Next call is from Redding, California, on Richard Nixon.
Hi. One of you made a remark that really piqued my interest. I wasn't looking at the screen, so I don't know which one it is, but you said that he was the last liberal president, and I'd like you to expound on that, and also tell me if his policies and actions with China play into that opinion. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I mentioned the last liberal president, and I'm referring to his domestic policy primarily. Getting back to what John referred to earlier, in 1946 he ran as a practical liberal in that election of 46. He wasn't quite a liberal, but the policies which he approved of while he was president, facing a Democratic Congress, represented massive liberal reform. For example, he was the greatest environmental president, probably, at least he signed off on bills for the environment since Theodore Roosevelt. He introduced the first welfare reform program. He introduced the first war on cancer. He's responsible for the 18-year-old vote. He's responsible for the ending the draft, for Amtrak, for OSHA, a whole series of activities which you would attribute to someone perhaps like Lyndon Johnson or John Kennedy, not a Republican. And since then, since Richard Nixon, we don't find the same kind of liberal legislation domestically in the last 20 years.
The prior caller's passion deserves recognition, not only for the sake of events he was part of, but also because it underscores the extent to which arguments about Richard Nixon in our political culture, to a very great extent, remain arguments about the war in Vietnam. There's a new strain of scholarship, Louis Sorley's book, A Better War, that discusses the extent to which troops on the ground in Vietnam accomplished the goals that had been set out for them by the Nixon administration by the end of 1972. As a result of which, it is possible to argue that the actions that Richard Nixon took as president, the very politically dangerous and lonely actions such as the Cambodian incursion, the bombing of North Vietnam in May and December of 1972, may very well have brought about a salutary outcome in terms of ensuring or giving South Vietnam a fighting chance to survive. Historians are taking the first step, which is giving General Abrams and the troops on the ground credit for having done their job. The next step is to understand that the Commander-in-Chief did his job by providing the political cover and the political vision in which it was possible for the military for the first time to do its job. So we sort of have a hiccup so far in our scholarship. We're focusing on General Abrams, and that's good. But Richard Nixon essentially wasted his presidency, at least insofar as the Democratic Congress, which became increasingly enraged at him over Vietnam, is concerned, hence fueling the passions of the following year in Watergate.
During his term in office, real quick answer, John Taylor, what were his congressional numbers? How many Democrats, how many Republicans in the Congress?
I don't recall, but the Democrats controlled the Congress for his entire presidency.
Entire presidency with a solid majority?
Solid majority.
Let's go back to biography. Patricia Nixon. Pat was a nickname. We've learned as we've gotten ready and read some books about this. Her real name was Thelma, is that right, John Taylor?
Thelma Ryan.
How did they meet?
They met in a play. Richard Nixon was a thespian. In fact, he met his first girlfriend, with whom he was involved for 5 years, also in a play in college. Here he met in the community players with Pat. And the story is told, I don't think it's apocryphal because it's repeated so often, and Pat told the story herself. He took one look at her and said, "I'm going to marry you." And of course she laughed at him. And for about 2 years he pursued her doggedly, persistently, as he did most everything in his life. And ultimately in 1940 they were married.
Was she happy as a political wife? Is that also something she enjoyed?
Supposedly, especially the early rough years, after the Voorhees campaign and the Douglas campaign, and even after the vice presidential campaign in '52, she said she did not like politics. She extracted on several occasions promises from her husband not to run again. And it was the ugliness of the political debate. You may remember her banning of the column of the cartoonist Herb Bloch's cartoons from her house in the Washington Post and elsewhere because the caricature of her husband was so grim and dark.
Next call as we talk about Richard Nixon, Austin, Texas.
Hi, my name is Helen, and I'm a 7th grader, and I was wondering if the Nixons ever had a cat.
That's a good question. I have never heard of a Nixon cat, but I'll bet there was one. There was a series of Nixon dogs, an Irish setter that the future president had when he went off to law school and that was given away while he was gone, and a model of which he purchased for $25 after he graduated from law school to remember the first Irish setter by. There was King Timahoe. There was, of course, the famous Checkers from the vice presidential campaign. The Nixons were both pet lovers, and there you see Richard Nixon in New York City with Checkers. I want to note for your viewers' sake that the photograph that was just shown a second ago, a lovely photo of the president in his morning coat with his first lady, was actually taken not in 1960 but in 1971, just after the wedding of their elder daughter, Tricia Nixon, to Edward Cox. And it became President Nixon's favorite photograph of himself with Mrs. Nixon, and he had it in his office until the day he died. It would fade. He would order a new one after 2 or 3 years and put it up again. And they were smiling both because of their joy at the occasion and because the National Weather Service had followed the president's orders so that it would not rain during the wedding, which it did not do.
How many daughters?
2 daughters, Tricia Nixon Cox and Julie Nixon Eisenhower, the former of New York City. The latter lives near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Next call is from Omaha. Omaha, you're on the air.
Hello?
Last try. Omaha, are you there?
Hello?
Go ahead, please.
Oh, yeah, my question is for the earlier caller who said that Nixon said he was going to end the war. If he had been allowed to continue the bombing, I think the war would have been ended a lot sooner and with a lot fewer casualties. If you look at the Gulf War, that's one of the things that helped us out was all the bombing. It took care of a lot of the civilians and saved a lot of American lives. Had he been allowed to stay, it would have been a lot sooner ended than it was.
Small?
Well, when he took office, he did tell, especially Congressman Don Regal, who I happened to meet on the beach one time in Upper Michigan. I said, "Congressman Regal, did he really tell you he'd end the war in 6 months?" He says, "Yes, he would." There we were in bathing suits discussing this momentous momentous statement by the president. When he took office, he did in fact secretly escalate, using protective reaction clauses in the bombing pause that Johnson had negotiated. He bombed North Vietnam early in '69, and then, of course, he engaged in secret bombing of Cambodia, beginning in March of '69. And in fact, that's kind of the beginning of Watergate, really, in many ways, because when the story leaked out, the secret bombing of Cambodia in May of '69, the New York Times, President Nixon and Henry Kissinger ordered people's lines in the administration and journalists to be wiretapped. And this ends up being part of the bill of particulars in the impeachment of Richard Nixon.
John Taylor, we learned with Lyndon Johnson that President Johnson personally selected targets for bombing. Talk about Richard Nixon's approach to the Vietnam War. How involved? Who were his key advisors?
His key advisors, of course, were the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Dr. Henry A. Kissinger, who soon, after the Nixon administration began, opened a secret channel leading to secret peace talks at Paris.
Who was Henry Kissinger?
Henry Kissinger was his national security advisor, later simultaneously national security advisor and Secretary of State. I would say that the one regret that Richard Nixon expressed about Vietnam was that he had not bombed North Vietnam in a sustained fashion sooner. Scholarship recently published by Stephen J. Morris of Johns Hopkins University, who has worked in Moscow archives containing information showing what the North Vietnamese attitude was toward the war in 1971 and 72, indicate that nothing frightened the North Vietnamese more than American bombing, and that they had come to the conclusion by the end of 1972 that Richard Nixon had decided that protecting South Vietnam was a vital American interest. Accordingly, Richard Nixon believed that had he demonstrated that air power sooner, it might have brought the war to a quicker end and also sustained South Vietnam. As far as the 6 months thing is concerned, the point is well taken. It just shows that a war is harder to end honorably than it is to start. And history has shown that time and time again. Richard Nixon said over and over again he wanted to end the war in a way that would validate the sacrifices made by the tens of thousands who had died there and the 3 million who served. And by 1973, he and Dr. Kissinger had completed a peace that they believed gave South Vietnam a chance to survive. We'll never know because the president's authority was so weakened by Watergate.
We have a clip we're going to show you about the silent majority, a phrase very popular at the time.
For the future of peace, precipitate withdrawal would be a disaster of immense magnitude. A nation cannot remain great if it betrays its allies and lets down its friends. Our defeat and humiliation in South Vietnam, without question, would promote recklessness in the councils of those great powers who have not yet abandoned their goals of world conquest. This would spark violence wherever our commitments help maintain the peace.
That was what had come to be known as the silent majority speech. Where did the whole concept of the silent majority come from?
Silent majority appeared somewhere in '67 or '68. I think it may have come from a Democratic senator. And the idea was to appeal to the majority of Americans who didn't run out in the street and protest, who were not ideologically polarized, who represented the old America, the America of a different kind of culture when they didn't have X-rated movies and the like. And this was a target to which President Nixon was appealing on November 3rd, 1969, because he had lost something due to the previous anti-war moratorium of October 15th, which was the most successful anti-war demonstration in the length of the entire war. So now he's going after the people who don't come out in the street and don't demonstrate, the nationalistic, patriotic, old-fashioned Americans, the old-fashioned Americans who would understand this home in Yorba Linda.
How old were you, John Taylor, in 1968, 69?
Oh my goodness, 24 in it's 1968. I'm sorry, 14.
14. How much do you remember of the time?
I was a prep school student and later a college student during the war, and I remember the incredibly shrill nature of on-campus protests at the time. I believe the saddest day in the history of my particular university was in April 1975. A group of demonstrators ran the Khmer Rouge flag over one of the plazas in place of the American flag, a movement which the United States and President Nixon had tried desperately to keep from power in Cambodia, and which, once it took power, slaughtered 2 million souls in an ideological purge. It was a time of immense social upheaval. The anti-war movement, which was the product of a by and large privileged American young elite, dovetailed as well with the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the women's movement. And the baby boomer generation has a great deal indeed to be proud of. But I think the one weak plank in their platform is that they were fundamentally wrong about what was at stake, both tactically, strategically, and also morally in Vietnam. And it is the thing which baby boomers find it most difficult to revisit, because it was essentially a consequence of the American vacuum in Indochina that followed 1973 and 1975 that permitted brutal regimes to come to power in both Vietnam and in Cambodia. And I think historians have much to do yet to determine what it is America really wrought in Indochina.
Dr. Small, it's in a period that seems to interest you. You've written about it in a couple of different books. We have already had a couple of young people calling in today for whom this is ancient history. Can you talk about why the United States was in such a state of foment? We had political assassinations, we had social upheaval, we had civil rights protests, a war going on foreign shores. What was it that made the 60s so turbulent?
But many of the things that appeared in the 60s, women's movement, civil rights movement, in fact even black nationalism, critiques of our foreign policy, an attack upon conventional values, they'd been around in the 50s and in the late 40s. But you had this kind of burst all of a sudden, catalytically it seems, beginning with the civil rights movement and then leading on to the war, which spawned other kinds of movements. You can't explain this, why one decade, which by the way I would say the decade is 64 to 74, beginning with the Beatles perhaps, or the assassination of John Kennedy. It isn't really the 60s, it's the 60s till Nixon's resignation. Historians don't know why this happens, except that you can find the origins of many of these activities below the surface during the seemingly happy days of the Eisenhower years.
And Richard Nixon, of course, running for the presidency, knowing the state that the country was in. It was not his first bid. The first one happened in 1960. After this next call, we'll talk about the 60 campaign. Next call is from Kailua, Hawaii.
That's Kyle Louis.
Welcome.
Has anyone given thought to making a national holiday with the death of Richard Nixon, like a big Mardi Gras festival, or Nick at Night could run Saturday Night Live all night or something?
Well, why do you feel so strongly about Richard Nixon?
The evidence. So what he did in the White House, his criminal practices in the White House. I mean, the guy was a disgrace to the presidency that probably definitely hasn't been repaired and maybe never will be.
Thank you. John Taylor.
Well, again, passion is matched to Richard Nixon and always has been. He has been a dividing line figure early in the Cold War as a result of the Alger Hiss case, as a result of being someone who was a harbinger and a prophet in a way of concern both about the danger of internal domestic communism and the ideological threat posed by Moscow and later by Beijing. He ultimately was a reconciler, and we need to talk, I think, about what he did to make the world safer and more stable for billions of people and his policies toward the Soviet Union and China and the Mideast. But he remained, because of Hiss, because of his anti-communism, and ultimately because of Vietnam, someone about whom people are still arguing. Indeed, it is my hope and desire that they continue to do so. He predicted himself, and Dr. Small alludes to this in the introduction of his book, that it would take many years for people to look fairly and objectively at his time in office because of the passions of the era. So it's the goal of our institution here at the Nixon Library to keep the dialogue going, and at the Nixon estate, of which I'm a co-executor, to do what we can to get the remaining Nixon tapes open as quickly as possible so the full record can be seen and history can make its own judgments.
Well, quick note on that. Even this week, reading headlines in the newspaper about the legal challenge that the library has to actually retain or get control of the Nixon tapes. Can you tell us about the status of that?
Well, what's happening, in fact, is that Richard Nixon brought a suit in the early 1980s seeking to be reimbursed for the taking of his presidential records. They are inalterably in the hands of the government. That won't change. But Richard Nixon sensed in the early 1980s that the federal government, for whatever reason, would not want to operate his library as it does the other presidential libraries. But he and his friends thought that a presidential library ought to be constructed. His friends sometimes more than he. So he brought the lawsuit, and specified that all of the income from any judgment or settlement would come to the Nixon Foundation. There have been headlines recently to the extent that his family is seeking millions. That was the headline in Associated Press dispatch. In fact, the Nixon family will receive little, if of nothing, from any proceeds, owing to the fact that the estate has already been very heavily taxed. Any money coming from a settlement would come to the Nixon Foundation to help us operate this nonprofit foundation, which runs both the library and archive in Yorba Linda, and an affiliated, intellectually independent, bipartisan think tank in Washington known as the Nixon Center.
So, to make it clear, the other presidential libraries we'll visit are associated with the National Archives. This is not.
All paid for by the taxpayers. The Nixon Library is the only one to persist and to operate entirely without taxpayers' funds.
How many visitors do you get each year?
Get about 150,000 visitors a year. We are third in Orange County after Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm.
And what's
a somewhat distant third after Knott's Berry Farm.
What's your budget?
Our budget is $4.7 million a year, about $3.6 spent at the archives and library and museum here in Yorba Linda, a little over $1 million spent by the Nixon Center in Washington.
Springfield, New Jersey, on Richard Nixon.
Hi, this is Lauren Belva from Springfield, New Jersey. My question is, in 1972, Nixon opened China to the United States. Can you please explain why he did that?
Thank you very much. I should tell our guests that we have a very active classroom in Springfield, New
Sounds
Jersey,
like it, yeah.
where one teacher is encouraging his students to participate in the program. That's who we're hearing from.
Yeah, the United States had not recognized formally the People's Republic of China from its inception in 1949 until 1972, and then there was only an informal recognition when Nixon went there. We formally recognized them in 1979. President Nixon felt, as he had written in an important foreign affairs article several years earlier, that we had to integrate China into the world community. He said that up front. Really, behind the scenes, he was interested in a very clever and successful policy of triangulation, because by the time that Nixon went to China in '72, China's worst enemy was not the United States, it was the Soviet Union and vice versa. So Nixon, by going to China, was able to, in fact, get quite a few concessions from the Soviet Union and play them off against the Chinese. And obviously, someone was going to go to China someday. Interestingly, Nixon was very fond of saying only Richard Nixon could do something like this. In fact, that's true because the Republican Party of Richard Nixon had made it almost impossible for a Democrat to go to China. John Kennedy would have preferred to open relations with China. Lyndon Johnson would have done it, but the political flack would have been terrible. A Republican like Richard Nixon could do it, and he did.
We are sitting in the garden area of the library in Yorba Linda, and I might tell our audience watching today that we are very much in the midst of Yorba Linda here with a very busy street outside of us. So if you're hearing a little bit of traffic, that's the way it is here, not like the Lemon Grove days of California when the Nixons first settled here. Where is Yorba Linda in relationship to Los Angeles?
Yorba Linda is it is west-southwest of Los Angeles, probably about 35 miles from downtown. We are due, I said west, east-southeast of downtown Los Angeles, and we are due east of the Los Angeles International Airport. We're really sort of geographically and even culturally more part of southern Los Angeles County. And indeed, towns like Whittier and La Habra run very deep in Nixon lore. We are well north of the heart of Orange County, as represented by Newport Beach and communities such as that.
Take our next call. Hobbs, New Mexico.
I have about 80 books by and about Richard Nixon, so I should know, but I don't. I wanted to ask whether his defeat in the 1962 governor's race was primarily his weakness or Pat Brown's strength, as well as do you think he would have been an outstanding Secretary of State if he had accepted Eisenhower's offer late in his term to improve his stature for the 1960 election?
Thank you very much. Before you answer that specifically, let's go through a little bit of the political career chronology. The last we left was the House race against Jerry Voorhees.
Let's begin. In 1946, Nixon is elected to the House. He's re-elected with really no competition in 48. He runs for the Senate in 50 and wins against Helen Gahagan Douglas. Then he becomes Eisenhower's vice presidential running mate. Now think about this now. He's 33 years old when he enters politics in 46. In 52, he's running for the vice presidency. He runs for the vice presidency again, of course, with Eisenhower. The caller alluded to the Secretary of State offer, which we can get to. He runs for the presidency in 1960 and loses by a hair. Runs for the governor of California in 62, and then, of course, he loses that election as well. Then for 6 years, he doesn't run again. Then, of course, he runs in 1968 and 1972. Bob Dole said at his in his eulogy, this was the age of Nixon. Think about this. He was around in politics almost all the time, almost always running for a national election from 1946 to 1972.
We have a clip from the 1960 campaign where he's talking about President Eisenhower. Let's listen.
When I think of the burdens that he has carried, the responsibility that has been his, when I think also of the splendid record that he has made in every way, and particularly the dignity and the decency and the immense goodwill and feeling and affection for people that he has brought to the office of the presidency, I realize that for any man, be it Mr. Kennedy or myself, to follow in his footsteps will be a tremendous responsibility and a challenge which it will be very difficult for us to meet.
Of course, he lost the 1960 campaign against John Kennedy by what margin?
Oh gosh, it was a couple of tenths of percentage points in terms of popular election. It was larger in the Electoral College, but then you look at a couple of states which went for Kennedy under maybe cloudy circumstances, particularly Illinois and Texas. And if Nixon won Illinois and Texas, he would have won the election. And
the caller's question was about the governor's campaign in
It was in 1960. It was 118,000 votes, I think, a hair's breadth. It is a good question, and there are a number of reasons why he lost in 1962. First of all, he really didn't want the job. Friends had urged him to run as a service to the party, but his heart wasn't in it. Second, the Cuban Missile Crisis intruded in October of 1962. And Richard Nixon, being a bipartisan in his approach to foreign policy, of course, supported the Democratic President Kennedy, and that support essentially stymied, as did the crisis itself, any momentum he had to win. It just wasn't his time, and in a way it was a saving grace, because had he been elected in 1962, it's likely he would have been a front runner for 1964 and might very well have been beaten by Johnson, although probably not quite as soundly as Goldwater was beaten.
Lexington, Kentucky, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Please bear with me. I'm terribly nervous. I've heard of Nixon here on this program, and through my life I've heard Nixon referred to as a criminal. Please tell me if the wiretaps that he had ordered, if they weren't legal at the time that he had ordered. Also, there was a lot of talk of the tape where he was mentioning the money. While that was discussed, was any money ever dispensed to anybody? Thank you very much.
Dr. Small?
Yes, thousands of dollars were dispensed to the 7 Watergate burglars, 5 and their handlers. In many ways, people would argue that was, the Nixon people argued that was to help their expenses at a hard time and legal expenses. Others would argue it was hush money. The question about criminality is an interesting one. When Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, at the time there were at least 7 to 10 possible cases against him which might have gone to court, and 7 or 8 of them were criminal cases. We'll never know, because they never went to because Nixon was then pardoned and never went to trial over those things. One could argue easily, I think, that some of the wiretapping that he ordered was, if not clearly illegal, obviously extra-legal, and a whole series of other activities that constitute the Watergate, what John Mitchell called the White House horrors.
When was the pardon issued by Gerald Ford?
Pardon was issued on September 8th, I believe, 1974.
John Taylor, want to answer that question?
I do, because it's important to remember that Richard Nixon resigned prior even to being impeached by the House, and certainly before a Senate trial. And as his attorney Jack Miller said just last week at a conference, he resisted the pardon at first with every fiber of his being, because he knew he would essentially be saying, without really meaning to be saying, that he was guilty as charged. It is vitally important that the details of what really happened during Watergate be carefully examined. If one looks at the new Watergate tapes that were released in 1996, there is not a hint in any White House discussion involving Richard Nixon that Richard Nixon believed money being paid to Watergate defendants was being used as hush money. The first ever discussion of hush money in the president's presence was March of 1973, and no hush money was paid as a result of that conversation. It doesn't mean that he should have discussed it. He said later he probably shouldn't have permitted the discussion. He said he was taken by surprise. But in all the tapes made between June of 1972 and March of 1973 until the famous March 21 conversation, there is no discussion by the president of hush money.
Next, San Jose, California.
Yeah, good afternoon. The thing that's always fascinated me about Nixon is that he was a dedicated, lifelong dedicated and skilled politician, but a man who seemed not to like people very much or be good with them, or have a good political sense in certain crucial areas. Leaving the moral issues aside, it seems to me that the Watergate adventure was so politically dangerous that a much more aware and sensitive politician would have written it off at the beginning on that point alone. And I'd like to take both of the director who knew him personally and the historian who studied his life.
Thanks. This time let's start with John Taylor.
Well, President Nixon's friend and Secretary of Commerce Maurice Stans once said Richard Nixon was an introvert in an extrovert's profession. President Nixon was actually very good with people. He was good with people whom he knew and was comfortable with. Sometimes in public he seemed different. He sometimes seemed a bit more formal. Part of it was that he believed that was appropriate. The people wanted their presidents and their public figures to be formal and to be somewhat statesmanlike. We have had politicians in our history who are astonishingly good, speaking intimately in front of tens of millions of people. That isn't necessarily equal to sort of good moral standing. It just is a charismatic ability, which has its applications in political life, certainly, but which isn't necessarily an indicator of particular vision, particular qualities of moral purpose, and any other factor other than charisma. It's a neutral capacity. I think President Nixon actually was a very effective communicator, a very effective speaker. We spoke earlier about the silent majority speech, which was vitally important. His polls went up 13 points after he gave that message, which was more than any president's had ever gone up as a result of a foreign policy speech on television. So he had the capacity to lead, he had the capacity to inspire. He did not necessarily have the capacity to make it seem as though you were his best friend and long-lost Uncle Richard sitting in his living room not knowing him. And perhaps that capacity is, in this day and age, somewhat overrated in any event.
Dr. Small, did you ever meet Richard Nixon?
No, I never did, and I'm sorry I didn't. And but it is interesting that when he was in law school, most of his colleagues thought he would be a college professor because he didn't like interacting with people the way a politician might have to interact, and he kind of liked the contemplative life as kind of an intellectual, and he carried it over into the White House. He's the only president I know of who spent so much time out of the White House in a private office in the executive office building rather than in the Oval Office, so he could be alone. So he could be alone with his fondest companion, his legal yellow pad.
His law school nickname?
Gloomy Gus, or Iron Butt. He had two of them.
And what was the second?
Iron Butt.
What was it?
Oh, because he was able to sit in a seat and study his butt off.
Beloit, Wisconsin.
Good afternoon. My question is concerning a recent trip I'd made to the Green Bay Packer Hall of Fame in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I saw a picture of Mr. Nixon attending a Green Bay Packer game, and there was also a personal check of the president's on display that was made as a donation to the erection of the Green Bay Packer Hall of Fame. My question is, was the president a true Green Bay Packer fan?
He was a Packers fan. He generally rooted for the hometown team wherever he happened to be living at the time. So when he was in Washington, he was a Skins fan. When he was in California after leaving the presidency, he was a California Angels fan. And when he was living in New York after 1980, he was both a Yankees fan and a Mets fan. In fact, if you look in our museum, you'll see a transistor radio in the recreation of the study that he used in the last few years of his life. Sometimes when he and one of his grandsons, Christopher Cox, would be watching baseball together, they would have two games on simultaneously, so they'd watch a Mets game on television and listen to the Yankees game on the radio, or vice versa. He was a hometown rooter, and he used to take the so-called Red Line to see minor league games in Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s. Before there was Major League Baseball in Southern California.
Well, speaking of looking inside the library, we're going to do that now. Let's introduce you to a woman who has been a docent here at the library since it opened in 1990. Her name is Jo Lyons, And the docents here are volunteer positions. Both she and her husband have volunteered to give tours and help interpret the life of Richard Nixon. Where are you standing right now?
Well, I'm in the Lincoln sitting room, Susan.
And why is there a replica of the Lincoln sitting room here?
When this facility was being planned, they called the president and they asked him if he'd like to have an Oval Office recreated in his center. And he said, no, I'd rather have a Lincoln sitting room, because that was his favorite room in the White House, and it's one that we wouldn't get to see on the public tour because it's on the second floor next to the private quarters of the first family.
What are some of the important items there on display?
Here we have on the little writing desk books from the president's personal library. His favorite author was Tolstoy. The dog figurine is called King Timahoe, and it reminded him of an Irish setter that he had as a child. Timahoe is a small little town in County Kildare, Ireland, where the Millhouse family originated.
Are those the president's reading glasses?
Yes, they are.
I don't think I've seen photographs of Richard Nixon with glasses.
There aren't very many. You have to really look for them here in the library.
And in that book, I've noticed a little bit of scribbling in the margins, some notes. Was he someone who really did a lot of marginalia as he read?
Yes, he did. This particular book was written by Charles de Gaulle, and it's called The Edge of the Sword. And you can see it's heavily annotated by the president.
John Taylor, how many books did Richard Nixon write?
He wrote 7, I believe.
Joe, he wrote 10.
10? Oh, I'm behind by 3.
You claimed you'd read them all, Joe.
Yeah, no, I didn't, John.
Joe Lyons, what else should we see in the room?
Well, the chair that's here in the corner, that was given to President Nixon by Mrs. Nixon in 1962 as a birthday present. And so when they moved into the White House, the chair came with them, and it went into the Lincoln sitting room, and that's why we have it in this setting here today.
We had a question earlier about animals, and I see a box of, is that dog biscuits?
Yes. In the evening, he would call the White House kennels and have the 3 dogs brought up to join him in the Lincoln sitting room, and he always had treats waiting for them.
Let's take another telephone call on Richard Nixon's life. This call is from Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
I have a couple of questions. The 1960 election turned on a little over 100,000 votes. What do you think might have happened had President Nixon chosen to challenge that election? What results might have occurred from that? And then why do you think he appeared to have such a cordial and friendly relationship with John Kennedy? Thank you.
Thanks very much. John Taylor, how old was Richard Nixon in 1960?
Well, let's see, 1913 minus 1960, so he was 43? No, I'm getting that wrong. 47. He was 47. He would have turned 47 on January 9th of 1960.
Okay, and again, the margin was?
The margin was about 114,000 votes.
And was there talk of a challenge?
There was, but before we get to that, which is a wonderful question, we earlier saw a very somber Vice President Nixon talking about General Eisenhower. Eisenhower was eager and desperate, I wouldn't say desperate, he was eager to get onto the campaign trail for Richard Nixon. But Mamie Eisenhower, the First Lady, had quietly come to the Vice President and said that the President's doctors did not want him to campaign, and she was afraid he, having suffered 2 heart attacks in office, wouldn't survive a campaign swing. So Vice President Nixon went to General Eisenhower and said, Mr. President, or General Eisenhower, as I think the Vice President called him, we really don't need you to campaign, which he did in order to do obviously what the First Lady wanted him to do. So the first what if is, what if Vice President Nixon had been able to have General Eisenhower campaigning for him? Regarding the recall, General Eisenhower again urged Richard Nixon to demand a recall. But President Nixon did not want there to be 2 or 3 or 4 months of uncertainty in the greatest democracy on God's green earth about who the president was going to be. And he didn't believe that would be appropriate for America. The same reason he decided to resign prior to impeachment and a trial in 1974, because he believed it was a job on with the people's business and not to become preoccupied with one's own situation.
Dr. Melvin Small, take the question on the relationship with John Kennedy.
Well, they both entered Congress the same year, in 1946, and they both were in the Navy, and they were on similar committees. They were both on the House Education and Labor Committee, and in fact debated the Taft-Hartley Act. Joe Kennedy, who was a conservative Democrat in 1950, gave Jack Kennedy money to contribute to Nixon's senatorial campaign against the Democrat. They got along okay. They weren't pals, and they certainly had quite different lifestyles. Nixon was always somewhat, especially after Kennedy won the presidency, always somewhat resentful of this boy born with the silver spoon in his mouth, and he felt he was nowhere near as heavy and solid an intellect as he was. And also, after all, they were both in the Navy, and Jack got his boat shot out from under him, and Dick didn't.
Next, Joe Lyons, to you. You've worked here since the library opened, and I mentioned that your husband volunteers here as well. What about this place attracted you? Why did you take this on?
Well, there aren't very many cities in the United States that can say that they have a presidential center. And so we both thought it would be a very unique opportunity to get in at the very beginning. And that's why we joined.
There were about 4 years that after the library opened that the president was still alive. Did you have a chance to meet him?
Yes, several times.
And do you have any personal stories you can share with our audience?
I made the replica of the birthplace, which is now on exhibit in the lobby. And so I had the pleasure of giving it to the president in 1992 personally.
And what was his reaction?
He was stunned, very stunned.
And we had a question earlier about his ability to interact with people. How did you find him?
Very friendly. He really did enjoy being with people, meeting new people, meeting the people that came to his library to enjoy reading about his career and about his personal life. Yeah.
What's the #1 question tourists ask you?
Actually, they want to know if the birthplace was moved in here from somewhere else.
And what's the answer?
The answer is that it was built right here by Frank Nixon, right here on the property.
We're going to ask you to move on to one of the other exhibits in the library called World Leaders. As you move on, let's take some telephone calls. Philadelphia, next.
Hello. One of the most fascinating things to me about President Nixon is this giant of the 20th century, in the middle of his great political career, went into private practice, I believe as an attorney in New York, and I understand he even litigated a Supreme Court case. I was wondering if either gentleman could comment on whether or not he enjoyed private practice, whether or not he was a successful attorney, and could comment perhaps also on the specific case which he litigated in front of the Supreme Court. If I could, I'd like to hang up and listen to the comments.
Sure. Thanks for your call.
Yeah, after he lost the governorship of California, he moved to New York City and then became a lawyer in the firm of John Mudge.
Nixon, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander.
And there he met, among other people, by the way, John Mitchell and Leonard Garman, who went into his administration. Nixon litigated the Time versus Hill case about some people who thought they were being unfairly portrayed in a film, The Desperate Hours. And he evidently argued splendidly before the Supreme Court. Primarily, he was a rainmaker in the law firm, bringing in big clients to this firm, including Pepsi-Cola. And he also used the firm, as many lawyers do, as kind of a springboard to political activities. He was an excellent litigator, at least in front of the Supreme Court, in a very important case.
How did John Mitchell serve him, and how did Leonard Garment serve him?
John Mitchell served him first as his Attorney General, and he came to Washington very reluctantly because his wife, Martha, was not well. And John Mitchell at first resisted, but President Nixon finally persuaded him to come and be his Attorney General. Later, he was the chairman of the Committee for the Re-election of the President for the 1972 campaign. Len Garment came as sort of a jack-of-all-trades. He was a domestic advisor. He played a key role in working with the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Arts. Richard Nixon had an outstanding and a progressive policy toward Native Americans. Len Garment was a key architect of that. Later, he served as White House counsel during a very difficult period and has written an interesting book about Richard Nixon and his own life, and is at work, I believe, on another as an attorney practicing now in Washington, D.C.
Sacramento, you're on the air.
Yeah, I had a couple questions, actually. One was on his relationship with President Carter. I know that you all sell a postcard there, and it has 3 of the Republican presidents and Nixon with their wives, I believe, but there is no Carter. And was that a snub? I assume that there was an invitation sent to him. Was that a snub towards Nixon, or how did that relationship end? And I guess, John, one question for you is, what did he feel his legacy would be the last couple months of his life?
President Carter said at the time of the library dedication that he had a scheduling conflict. He and Mrs. Carter, I believe, were out of the country. In the late 1970s, Richard Nixon advised President Carter very quietly on the moment just before the Carter administration was announcing its formalization of diplomatic relations with China. And there are records here at the Nixon Library that indicate that it was a very fruitful exchange and that President Carter asked the State Department to implement President Nixon's suggestions. They had a cordial relationship and traveled together in 1981 as part of President Nixon's delegation to the funeral of Anwar el-Sadat. And I've forgotten the other question, Susan.
It was, I only wrote down Carter. It'll come back to me as we move along, I promise. Lancaster, Ohio, you're on the air.
Yes, my name is James Watson, and I'm calling to ask the gentleman if they could comment about Nixon's vindictive nature, specifically the list that he had prepared of his enemies that I had heard he wanted people to put the screws to. And I remember a quote from the Nixon tapes when he was considering somebody for being the head of the IRS, and he said he wanted them to go after his enemies and things like that, and also some of the activities of CREEP. Thank you very much.
What was CREEP?
CREEP was the Committee to Re-elect the President. From what I heard, the name was originally CRP, Committee to Re-elect the President, and it was chosen by William Safire, who today is one of the world's great wordsmiths. He never realized that other people would make the acronym CREEP, CREEP, out of CRP. Nixon's vindictiveness. The problem in evaluating Nixon is that he's the only president for whom we have these tapes. If we had tapes for other presidents, perhaps we'd find their dark side as well. But we have these tapes in which Nixon appears to be an angry, insecure, vengeful person, continually talking about stamping out this person or getting that person, seeing enemies perhaps where there weren't any, particularly in the media and elsewhere. Absent the tapes, I think we might have a somewhat different image of Nixon.
John Tiller, why and how long did President Nixon decide to tape, and what exactly did he tape in the White House?
When he arrived in the White House in January of 1969, he found President Johnson's taping system and had it removed. Later decided to install his own to make a complete record of actions and statements made in his various offices. He taped between February of 1971 and July of 1973.
And what exactly was he taping?
He was taping, it was voice activated. President Johnson had tapes on his telephones. President Kennedy's taping system, the president was able to turn it on and off depending on what he wanted to record and what he didn't. Mel makes a very good point about other presidents, and I say this not to disparage other presidents. The Oval Office, particularly during a war, as President Nixon's Oval Office always was, but in general is a cauldron of tension, of very, very difficult decisions being made under the most difficult circumstances, and presidents have always let down their hair. If one reads in Richard Reeves' books, for instance, about President Kennedy's confrontation with steel executives in 1962 when he felt he had been betrayed regarding price increases, there are direct quotes from the president which are every bit as lurid as anything one might find on President Nixon's tapes, because the president felt, in fact, that an enemy had betrayed him. And as far as the use of the IRS is concerned, which the caller referred to, President Roosevelt had a conservative publisher audited, I believe. President Kennedy, I believe, had steel executives audited. But as Michael Barone recently reported in U.S. News and World Report, the rules of politics changed, in part as a result of the cultural sea change that occurred in America in general under President Nixon.
I would like to add, Victor Lasky, one of Nixon's supporters, wrote a book called It Didn't Start With Nixon, pointing out all the things, the IRS business and like, that other presidents had done. But I would conclude, I'm afraid, that some of the other previous presidents did some of those things a lot. And some of the presidents did all those things a little bit, but none of the presidents did all those things so much.
Next is a call from West Covina, California. You're on the air.
Hello.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for your series. My wife and I enjoy it very much. My question is, Richard Nixon first became, or made his name in the prosecuting of Alger Hiss, or as a communist fighter. After Joe McCarthy was exposed in the McCarthy hearings, did Nixon, either as vice president or as president, disavow McCarthy or his tactics?
Thanks very much. will you spend a minute and talk about the Alger Hiss case so people understand what it is?
Alger Hiss was a former State Department official and chairman of the Carnegie Endowment, who in 1948 was accused before the House Committee on the House Committee on Un-American Activities, of which Richard Nixon, as a congressman, was a member, of spying for the Soviets and being part of a communist cell. Richard Nixon became the spearheading member of the committee investigating Alger Hiss. Some did not believe Whittaker Chambers' allegation. Ultimately, as a result largely of Richard Nixon's efforts and also those of Robert Stripling, the chief counsel of the committee, and others, Alger Hiss was convicted of perjury in a New York federal trial in 1950. And in 1995, when the Venona papers were released, the United States government's previously secret accounts of what it had learned about the extent of Soviet espionage in pre- and post-World War II America, it became clear to all but the most relentless diehard Hiss partisans that Alger Hiss had in fact sold out his country before and during World War II. But again, there were many people who never forgave Richard Nixon for pursuing this lion of the Eastern establishment, and it caused this division over him, which persists even today. When many now say, well, even if Alger Hiss was guilty, it's just too bad Richard Nixon had to profit by it. So he's caught in a double bind. He does the right thing, he exposes a danger, he exposes a traitor. He does so in a way that urged him the praise of President Eisenhower, who said to him, the thing about Hiss is not only that you got him, but you got him fairly. It was Richard Nixon who disavowed Joe McCarthy on behalf of the Eisenhower administration, because Richard Nixon and President Eisenhower considered McCarthy's tactics to have been reprehensible, not only on a moral and ethical basis, but also because he discredited a very worthy outlook, namely anti-communism.
Dr. Small, this is what put the young congressman on the map, is that right?
Yeah, the Alger Hiss case, it put him on the map, and he learned a whole bunch of lessons about American politics, about the media, about the Justice Department, the FBI, and the like. And George Reedy, who was Lyndon Johnson's press secretary, was then a news person, and he did say, he said, we were so angry with Nixon and that committee. We didn't want that committee to get anything right. And this was the beginning of this strong antagonism between the liberal media, particularly the major media on the East Coast, and Richard Nixon.
Let's return to the inside of the Richard Nixon Library and once again to docent Joe Lyons, who is going to show us a display that's called World Leaders. What's it all about?
Well, what you see here are statues, 10 of them, that look like bronze, but they're not. They were made by Ivan and Elliot Schwartz, who are brothers in Brooklyn, New York, and the statues are life-size. But actually, the clothing is real clothing and the chairs are real chairs.
And what's the significance of the exhibit?
These were 10 leaders who made a difference in the world. And I'm sure the audience will recognize that at least 6 of them are posed from famous photographs. The 2 men in front from China, Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, was part of a famous photograph taken during President Nixon's first visit to China. Behind them from the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev and his protege Leonid Brezhnev. This was a famous photograph taken during the kitchen debates in 1959.
What were the kitchen debates?
Nixon had gone to Moscow to see an exhibit on items that were being produced by the Soviet Union, and they got into quite a confrontation with Khrushchev telling Vice President Nixon that his grandchildren someday would live under communism, and actually was jabbing his finger into Vice President Nixon's chest, trying to ram home his point.
And who else is in the room?
Well, next to them are Anwar al-Sadat of Egypt and Golda Meir of Israel. This was a famous photograph taken in 1977 when he visited with her, and they strolled through a garden and they talked about peace between their 2 countries.
And finally, who else?
The next three of the 4 great superpowers, Winston Churchill of Great Britain, Charles de Gaulle of France, and Konrad Adenauer of West Germany. It was the sculptor's intent that when you stepped into their semicircle to look more closely into their faces, that the visitor represented us, the 4th great superpower.
Who selected the world leaders in the room? What were the criteria?
President Nixon selected them, and he selected them because they made a difference. They were leaders who did make a difference in the world.
Let's take a call, and then we'll come back and look at some of the items in the presidential gifts case. Springfield, New Jersey, once again, one of our students, I'm sure.
Hi, my name is Chris Melendez, and my question is, what were President Nixon's reasons behind the 90-day freeze of August of 1971?
Thank you. Dr.
Good
Small?
question. Yeah. Richard Nixon did something which you'd never expect a Republican to do. He introduced wage and price controls in the middle of 1971 in a variety of, as part of a new economic package, including international economic reform. The country was going through an extremely serious inflationary cycle. Also, it was called stagflation as well. We had high unemployment and high inflation. He was concerned about inflation, and to be honest with you, he broke his kind of Republican credo by approving wage and price controls to some degree because he's running for president in '72. This was a quick fix, which worked. The economy improved, particularly the inflation figures improved, and after 1973 and '74, the economy went, I hate to say, down the tubes again. But it worked between '71 and '72. It was primarily the domestic side of it had to do with domestic politics.
Medford, Oregon.
This is for Dr. Small. How does one reconcile the many Nixon anti-Semitic remarks on the tapes with the fact that he was surrounded by so many Jewish advisors? Was the latter just for political expediency?
That's an interesting question. Nixon probably had more important Jewish American advisors than any president in history. Henry Kissinger, Arthur Burns, Leonard Garment, William Safire, and the numbers go on. Privately, and not necessarily in front of them, he did often as a hard word, he did use ethnic slurs about Jewish people. His defenders say that's because most Jewish people didn't vote for him, or most Jewish people were liberals. He seemed to have kind of a small-town American, knee-jerk, waspish anti-Semitism, which lots of Americans had. Why did he have so many Jewish people around him? Because, in fact, part of the Jewish stereotype is Jewish people are smart. So you could be anti-Semitic and also have smart Jewish lawyers around you.
We heard about all of those people except for Arthur Burns. What was his role?
Arthur Burns was the head of the council, was his major domestic advisor, and then became head of the Federal Reserve Board in 1970.
Morristown, Pennsylvania, on Richard Nixon.
Yes, hi. My name is Lynn Carpenter, and my question has to do with something that I read in Jonathan Aiken's book, Nixon, A Life. He mentions in that book, after the Watergate situation, that many leaders from foreign countries were appalled at what had happened to Richard Nixon, and they felt that by the standards of their countries, what is considered a serious crime of a leader, that this was just a devastating state of affairs, that this could happen to the President of the United States. And knowing how well he got along with foreign leaders and knowing that he was probably our greatest foreign affairs president, I wonder if either of you gentlemen have heard anything to that effect or know the feelings of the foreign leaders on this subject.
John Taylor?
Well, ma'am, it is based on the record. President Nixon was someone who operated on the international stage, who had a definite vision for making the world a more stable and sort of better communicating place. When he came into office, the United States relations with the Soviet Union were dismal. We had no relations whatsoever with the People's Republic of China. We were at war, seemingly hopelessly, and the Mideast was a cauldron of seemingly insuperable conflict. All of that had changed dramatically within the next 4 years and within the next 5.5 years if you want to look at what was accomplished in the Mideast between 1973 and 1974. Accordingly, there was enormous regret on the international stage because a sometimes isolationist country, a country which sometimes is equivocal and uncertain about its international role, had for 5.5 years been led by a visionary, as someone with whom they could do business, who kept his promises and who conducted himself in an understandable and a very rational way, and they felt, unfortunately, that it was a bad thing for the country and the world.
Joe Lyons, in the museum, you've got on display there a number of the items from the White House years. Would you show us a couple of them?
Well, the one that draws the most attention are the diamonds and emeralds that were given to Mrs. Nixon by a Saudi prince. They were made by Harry Winston Jewelers in New York, and the prince purchased them from Harry Winston and then presented them to Mrs. Nixon.
How does it work when presidents are given gifts by ordinary citizens or foreign leaders?
Well, these are heads of state gifts, and so at the Nixon time there was a $50 limit on it. if it was worth more than $50 and he wanted to keep the gift, then he had to pay full face value for it. Right now, that same $50 is up to $260, but the rules are the same for the Clintons as they were for the Nixons.
How did the library acquire what is on display there?
These were not purchased by President and Mrs. Nixon, and so they were turned over to the National Archives, and then the Archives loans back to the presidential centers the items which the curator may pick to display.
Pick out another item that you think is interesting.
The jar from Masada, here on the top, very antiquity. And next to it, silver from Cambodia. Cambodia is known for their silver work.
Do you know if the President or the First Lady had some favorites among them? What were they particularly attracted to?
No, I really don't. I don't know if there were any favorites here or not.
How many artifacts do you have on display there?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that either.
And which one, other than the necklace, do people usually comment on?
That one would be in the next room, and that would be the Suzhou cat from China.
Thank you. We're going to see you in the next room in just a little bit. And John Taylor, you have some comments on the artifacts on display?
I have a comment about our docents, first of all. Joe is a charter member of a group of about 140 men and women who serve as volunteer museum guides 363 days a year at the Nixon Library. The Guild is a totally self-supporting, self-governing voluntary organization. Its current president is Audrey Voigt, and our first director of public programs, now retired and living near Chicago, is Evelyn Young. It is she who brought Joe and the other charter docents on board, so if Evelyn is watching, thank you. Wouldn't be possible to operate this place without Joe, Audrey, and their colleagues.
Let's go back to the presidential years and advisors. We've named a few. How about John Ehrlichman and Bob Haldeman?
Yeah, Bob Haldeman was the chief of staff, and John Ehrlichman was the chief domestic advisor. The president, as in foreign policy, began to centralize domestic policy within the White House, giving these two fellows, particularly Haldeman, who was kind of the gatekeeper for President Nixon, enormous influence and power. Ehrlichman, interestingly, was sort of a closet liberal politically, and he's responsible for a good deal of the Indian, Native American policy and other kind of environmental policy, because President Nixon, as John has pointed out, was primarily interested in foreign policy. Haldeman ran a tight ship, and from the outside he protected the president. His aides were considered by Republican politicians in Congress not to give them enough time with the president, to be somewhat arrogant. They were young, they were somewhat inexperienced politically, many of them from the advertising industry. There was a good deal of hostility to this wall built around Nixon by these Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and their aides.
What about the position of chief of staff? How many presidents have had them?
Eisenhower was the last president to have a chief of staff prior to Bob Haldeman, and that was Sherman Adams. And then in between there were people who kind of had that role. Haldeman was the first real chief of staff since Eisenhower.
Next telephone call. We'll come back to you, John Taylor, in just a minute. Sedona, Arizona.
Good afternoon.
Sedona, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Okay. Bill Casey calling from Sedona, Arizona. And the wife and I went to the viewing of President Nixon in Yorba Linda. We had to park, I believe, at least 2 miles away. That's the closest we could get. And as we started walking back to the viewing, a real torrent of rain started. We didn't have any rain gear. We walked a couple of blocks and got soaked. So we returned to the car, and as we were driving past the viewing, we couldn't get over. There was still an enormous crowd of people. They stayed right out in the rain. They had their children with them. And I did get to go back to the funeral the next day and get as close as I could. I just want to state I was in the Navy in World War II, took part in the invasion of Iwo Jima in Okinawa. Thank you.
Thanks for your call. John Taylor, I'm sure you remember that day well. How many people came here?
50,000 people filed by the casket that evening and night and morning until the Secret Service had to close the line for the sake of the 5 presidents and first ladies who were coming. It was an extraordinary outpouring, both of everyday Americans and neighbors and people from a long way away, and of world leaders, and the United States Congress sent an extraordinary delegation. It was in front of this little house that the casket was positioned. And Mel has spoken of Senator Dole's eulogy for President Nixon, in which he talked about this as being the age of Nixon. But Dole talked, he used almost a mantra in his speech where he talked about the life of Richard Nixon, and he ended every observation by saying, "How American, how American." And there was a sense in which this frontier lad, born in a community of 2,000 souls, who visited the places that he'd only dreamed of as a little boy reading the National Geographic, and moved the world in doing so, and accomplished many things that made his country a better place to live, and yet was and remains to a great extent misunderstood. This resonated with a lot of people. Richard Nixon was someone that you could understand. He was flesh and blood. And I think the American people, in expressing the affection for him and the respect for him that they did at the time of the funeral, gave him, I think, a much-deserved pause before the inevitable battles would ensue again over what his legacy had meant and what he had done and what he had not done, which I think is still being conducted in large part as part of the dynamics of the Vietnam era.
Melvin Small, that caller also referenced that he served in the Navy. We didn't talk about the fact that Richard Nixon served in the Navy. He was a Quaker. Why did he make the decision to join the forces?
Richard Nixon was a part of the Quaker establishment in California, which was not kind of 100% pacifist in that sense. There were members of his family who were pacifist, and it bothered him a bit when he did sign up. He was in Washington working in rationing as a young lawyer, and the opportunity came from the Navy they were recruiting young lawyers to go into the military. And he felt it was World War II. He was not terribly happy in his job in Washington. It was a chance to serve his country. He thought about it a bit and anguished a bit, and then he went off to the Pacific.
Next call is from Columbia, Missouri, as we discuss Richard Nixon, our 37th president.
Hi, this is Steve Bresney from Columbia. I was wondering if your guest could comment on Nixon and his Supreme Court appointees, namely Justice Blackmun, who I guess turned out to be a rather liberal justice. I wondered if Nixon regretted putting Blackmun on the court, and also, as long as you're talking about the court, maybe talk about his appointment of Berger to Chief Justice. I'll hang up and listen to your response. Thanks a lot.
Okay, let's split it in half. Melvin Small, how many appointments did Richard Nixon
He
get
made
to
4 appointments, and thus it becomes close to the Nixon court by the time he leaves the presidency. He appointed Chief Justice Berger. He appointed Rehnquist, who is now Chief Justice. He appointed Lewis Powell, and he appointed Blackmun. Blackmun is most known for writing the majority decision in the Roe versus Wade case in 1973.
And is there anything, as you look across the spectrum, that you can say about this group of appointees?
Well, the appointees were all over the ballpark politically. They moved the court somewhat to the right. Certainly Berger did as Chief Justice, and Rehnquist, of course. But Blackmun particularly and Powell were far more moderate or liberal, I think, than most Republicans, and certainly than Nixon expected. Nixon had been warned, interestingly enough, about Blackmun may have had, he was told, a couple of hippie daughters, and so he was concerned about that.
John Taylor, Warren Berger's selection as Chief Justice.
Well, President Nixon was proud of his Supreme Court appointments. He was proud of Berger. He was also very proud that his appointment, Rehnquist, became Chief Justice ultimately. I think it's important for us to reflect on Richard Nixon and the kind of Republican he was. We have a certain sense today of what a conservative Republican is. Nixon/Rockefeller type Republicans, if my colleague Richard Norton Smith at the Ford Library, who is a Rockefeller partisan, will excuse me, have fallen somewhat out of favor. In part because of wage and price controls, which Mel has eloquently discussed, and also because of his policies toward China and the Soviet Union. Richard Nixon alienated many true blue far-right conservatives in this country. And once Ronald Reagan became the exemplar of the Republican Party following the 1980 re-election, moderate Nixon-type Republicans have had difficulty finding their place in our political landscape. And indeed, it might even have had an impact in the Watergate crisis. Keep in mind that the first member of the Senate to call for Richard Nixon's resignation was not a fire-breathing left-winger, but in fact conservative James Buckley of Connecticut, expressing, I think, some of the skepticism of the far right of that era. So when you are a centrist, sometimes you can get fire from both of your flanks. I think it happened to Richard Nixon. There are times when it's happened to Bill Clinton as well.
San Jose, California.
Thank you very much for taking my call. I don't have a TV in front of me, so I really don't know your guest.
but I wrote an article titled Where's the Party of Ron, Barry, and Abe in the San Francisco Chronicle of June the 1st last year, before the election. And today Mr. Bush seems to have been showing in his speech that it's becoming the party of George W. Bush and coming right back. The point I want to make is to contrast his leadership and his foreign policy address today with President Nixon and his group of advisors, who also included George Shultz, in addition to Kissinger and Haig. The difference was that the President Nixon himself was far better informed than his advisors and towered head and shoulders above those guys. The same was true of President Kennedy. He had his advisors in Rusk, Bundy, and Sorensen, but he used to be much better informed. And there's a story which says that when he used to get his CIA briefings in the morning, he would generally mark out what they left out. What Governor Bush needs to do is not just become Condoleezed, which is a reference to Ms. Condoleezza Rice, but to hold his own in a lot more press conferences on foreign policies and domestic issues. What that would entail is that he gets better informed and better read and better informed, and starts participating in what President Nixon and President Kennedy used to call the bullseye of politics, which is...
Thank you, caller. I'm going to stop you at that point, because rather than talk about next year's presidential election, let's come back to his observations about President Nixon and his foreign policy advisors.
When President Nixon began pulling off what appeared to be astounding firsts in foreign policy, many skeptics in the media said, well, obviously it's because of his smart professor, Henry Kissinger, and that it was all at best a Nixonger policy. We now know from looking at the records that Nixon was a sophisticated foreign policy, not only strategist, but also tactician, and that while Kissinger certainly was a smart fellow and had some interesting ideas, he pretty much was not what he called himself at one point, the Lone Ranger of foreign policy, but he was a pretty obsequious tonto.
In addition to Henry Kissinger, who else did he rely on for foreign policy advice?
Well, to be honest with you, he and Kissinger played it close to the vest. That's one of the major critiques of their foreign policy. Can you run such a secret, covert diplomacy in a democracy so that even the Secretary of State and the rest of the Secretary of the State Department bureaucracy doesn't know what's going on? These two guys ran it out of their back pocket, and one of the critiques may be they couldn't possibly juggle all the balls they needed to juggle at one time, running such a covert, closed diplomacy with a handful of people in the National Security Council in the White House.
Another visit inside the library with Joe Lyons. She's going to show us the limousine that President Nixon used during the White House years.
This is a 1967 Lincoln Continental, and it was commissioned and served 4 presidents, starting with Lyndon Johnson. It weighs 11,000 pounds because it's armor-plated, and it has 2-inch thick bulletproof glass. If all 4 truck tires were shot out, the car could still go 50 miles an hour for about 40 miles.
Joe Lyons, can you open that
Yes.
rear door where the president would have entered and show us how thick those doors are?
This car also has some history. It went to China with President Nixon. It went to the Soviet Union when we learned that our embassy walls had been installed with listening devices. Their hotel room had been bugged, and so the President and Dr. Kissinger met in this car because they knew the Secret Service had never left it.
And maybe we can back up and show what the doors look like. Describe for an audience who can't open them, give us some comparison as to how heavy they are.
They're very heavy. I think you did see me struggle a little bit to get it open.
How did the library acquire the limousine?
One of the staff members found out that it was in storage in Detroit, and so it came down to the Republican convention held in San Diego several years ago. After the convention was over, the Mayflower Moving Company brought it up here for us to exhibit.
Another security item, if we can walk around to the back, where the Secret Service would stand. Explain how that works.
This bumper drops down, and the handle comes up from the trunk, and the Secret Service could stand on the bumper or the back platform here and hold on to the railing as they travel along. It also has built-in microphones by each rear view mirror, and on all 4 fenders there are buttons where the Secret Service could plug in the wire connecting them to the car in their ears so they could hear what was going on inside the car.
Joe and Susan, as Joe knows, for a while we had the car outside sitting on a bed of gravel, and a 3-year-old boy picked up a rock one day and hurled it at the driver's side glass and shattered it. thus demonstrating that in the old days they didn't have bulletproof glass on the driver's side, which the Secret Service has quietly confirmed, but has assured us that they don't make that mistake anymore.
A 3-year-old, I hope, who's thinking about a career as a pitcher in baseball. Joe Lyons, we're going to say goodbye to you at this point. Thank you so much for what you've shown us inside the library. Just a glimpse of the many exhibits there that are available for tourists as they visit, but we appreciate you letting us see what we have.
Thank you.
Let's return to telephone calls. We're talking about the life and presidency of Richard Milhous Nixon. Next call is from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Hello, I'm Susan Waxman from Ann Arbor, and I'm interested in B.B. Rebozo. I heard about him so much when I was in school, and I'm just very curious about how Nixon met him and their relationship. And I was also, since I'm from Michigan, interested in the Gerald Ford-Nixon connection.
Thanks very much. B.B. Rebozo.
President Nixon, as vice president, I believe, met his friend B.B. Rebozo thanks to an introduction by Florida Senator Frank Smathers, and they became fast friends. B.B. and Robert Aplin-Alp and Jack Drown and Bob Finch were some of the closest Nixon friends, but Mr. Rebozo was probably his closest friend. He was a Cuban-American, he was a banker and a businessman in the Miami area. During and after Watergate, Herculean efforts were made by untold armies of investigators to pin something on Mr. Rebozo, but they finally had to fold their tent in the mid-1970s, not having been able to convict him of anything more serious than having been the friend of Richard Nixon. And the friendship continued for many years thereafter.
Why would that caller have heard his name so often during the period?
Because President Nixon often spent time with Rebozo on vacation. Rebozo was a man who was not involved in politics, and he wasn't an intellect, and he didn't talk philosophically. He just kind of hung around with President Nixon, and Nixon enjoyed being with him. He didn't ask Nixon for much. Nixon didn't ask him for much. They sat around and they fished. Nixon might even be writing a speech for, they wouldn't even talk maybe for hours. He enjoyed having this man around as kind of an apolitical chum. Interestingly, introduced by a Democratic Senator, George Smathers.
As a Michigander, would you comment on the relationship with Gerald Ford?
Yeah, Gerald Ford came into Congress 2 years after Nixon did, and they both belonged to something called the Chowder and Marching Society, which is a group of about 15 young Republicans who were distressed with the conservative, the pace of conservative Republican politics. They weren't necessarily not conservative, but they didn't like the old guard necessarily in Congress. And so they knew one another in Congress for a couple of years. I did interview Ford, and Ford said that, interestingly, the Chowder and Marching Society was a place where Richard Nixon could let his hair down. And then he said, because I asked him about it, he said, in all that time hanging around with him in Congress, I never heard the kind of expletives that I heard on the tapes, which is kind of interesting, which suggests either that he wasn't listening or that he wasn't that close a friend. But they did know each other in Congress, and then, of course, Richard Nixon chose him to be his vice presidential replacement for Spiro T. Agnew, who no one has even asked a question about yet, which is one of the most interesting of all vice presidents.
Is it true, John Taylor, that Gerald Ford was on the short list of potential vice presidential running mates for Richard Nixon in his campaign?
Oh, it was, and he was a logical choice as minority leader, but finally I think the president decided he would like to keep him in that post. It was a close friendship. I think this profanity issue merits mentioning because the White House tapes were recorded in President Nixon's most private moments. They were discussions that were intended to be opportunities for the president to let off steam. We've discussed the tension that exists in any Oval Office, particularly one during peacetime, or wartime rather, but even Joan Hoff, who I know you'll be talking to soon, has indicated that as profanity goes, there isn't really that much on the White House tapes. That President Nixon was not really a very good swearer. He sometimes tried to be one of the guys, as all people sometimes do, but it was an overstated thing, and sometimes because the original White House transcripts of the tapes had expletive deleted, people sometimes read far worse things into the blank than really was justified by what was finally heard there.
Desert Hot Springs, California.
Yeah, this is Clifford. I really like your program. I've been watching a lot of it ever since you started it this year. But a couple of questions. First of all, how did Nixon feel, I'm sure I'm the only one who has thought about this, about winning the biggest landslide victory in the 72 re-election, taking 49 states to, of course, McGovern's one? And the second one is, how did Eisenhower end up picking Nixon as a running mate? And I'm going to hang up because I'd like to hear your answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 72 election?
'72 election was not a joyous occasion as one might have expected it to be. As I recall, the president actually broke a tooth on election night, so he was in pain, and he took that later as being a harbinger of the unpleasantness that was to come over the next 18 months until Watergate had run its course by August of 1974. President Nixon was not one particularly to rest on his laurels. He was focused at that time on having a successful second term. In our museum, we have an extraordinary list of things that President Nixon wanted to accomplish. Notes he made on election night and soon thereafter, domestic accomplishments, efforts to reform the federal government, to streamline the federal government, to rationalize the budget-making process, to extend the efforts he'd made to establish a better relationship with China and the Soviet Union. It was not a celebratory evening for him. It was almost as though a pall was cast and a foreshadowing was occurring of what was to come.
You have a question?
I'd like to just add on to that. I referred to President Nixon before as the last liberal president. Had he gone through his second term, he might not have been, because one of the things he was planning to do in his second term was to cut the budget dramatically for many of the social programs he had approved prior to that, and maybe to reorient the government. I think he was uncomfortable with being a self-perceived liberal in 1972. And the other question about why did Eisenhower choose him, the questioner asked, he was young, Western, conservative. Eisenhower is East, old, and perceived to be somewhat more moderate. He had a very, very popular following within the Republican Party, and of course he came from a state with a lot of electoral votes.
And there's one more reason, and I know Mel would add this. President Eisenhower wanted to be above the fray, and he wanted someone who could represent him in very difficult political battles, such as the one with Joseph McCarthy, so that General Eisenhower could continue to be grandfatherly. So he wanted someone who was an effective and eloquent partisan.
And that gets back to the Agnew business, because when Spiro Agnew began sounding a little bit like a stereotypical Richard Nixon from the 1940s, people referred to Agnew as being Nixon's Nixon. In other words, Nixon from the Eisenhower years, below the fray, the hard-hitting political, and Eisenhower above it. Nixon stands above it to some degree in the campaign of 1968, and Agnew, his vice presidential candidate, plays the old Nixon.
We're going to say thanks for now to our two guests here at Yorba Linda, California at the Nixon Library and Birthplace, and add another voice to our discussion. Her name is Joan Hoff, and she's written a book called Nixon Reconsidered. We're going to talk to her in just a minute, but as we're getting ready for that segment, we're going to show you a little bit of an interview that was recorded after the White House years with President Nixon and a gentleman named Frank Gannon. It was hours and hours of conversation, a almost video biography of President Nixon, which never made it to television. You're going to see a little bit of that next, and it is a question about Watergate and Vietnam. And then we'll talk with Joan Hoff.
Do you feel that you were in any way the last American casualty of Vietnam?
You know, some people have written that. It's an intriguing thesis. I guess I would have to respond this way. As you've already implied, if it had not been for Vietnam, there would have been no Pentagon Papers, there would have been no Ellsberg case, there would have been no plumbers, there would have been probably no wiretapping, because most of that was really directly related or indirectly related to the need to keep a very tight ship during wartime. There would have been no demonstrations, certainly no demonstrations about Vietnam. So that's one side of it. In that sense, I suppose I could be called a casualty. And then in another way, too, I guess it would have to be said that had it not been for Vietnam, the outrage about Watergate would not have been as virulent as it was. After all, the best and the brightest have been embarrassed by the fact that we ended the war when they said it couldn't be done and ended it in an honorable way, that we went to China, that we had an arms negotiation with the Soviet Union, some of the things which they had not achieved. And then we won an overwhelming election victory against their candidate, or the candidate of most of them, Senator McGovern. As they looked at those events, I think they began to be concerned, as they should have been, about whether they were to continue to have the role that they had traditionally have of being those who controlled and directed public opinion and affected the decisions of government in the future. And I would say in that case that consequently, when Watergate came, that it was manna from heaven. Now let me make it clear, Watergate was wrong. It was stupidly handled. And as far as, and we should have been attacked on it. But I would say that when you compare it with what happened previously, and this does not justify it, the virulence of the attackers was to a certain extent due to the fact that we had been through the Vietnam syndrome, and probably because we succeeded when they said we couldn't succeed.
And on your screen right now is Joan Hoff, who is the author of a book called Nixon Reconsidered. She's joining us from New York. Joan Hoff, let me start by asking you, we've had a chance for the past hour and a half to listen to Melvin Small. How would the two of you differ in your overall view of Richard Nixon?
Unfortunately, I didn't hear Mel.
Yes, but I'm sure you know his work.
I do know his work, and it came after my work, and by and large, we probably agree more than we disagree. I think we disagree probably more on foreign policy than we do maybe on his domestic achievements. But I was a student demonstrator against the war in Vietnam, and consequently, I don't give him any quarter on Vietnam. There was no peace with honor in that settlement. It simply took too long, and if he'd gotten out in '69, he would have had better terms than he had in '73. And Mel and I disagree over the impact that the demonstrations had on getting that war ended. As a demonstrator, I thought at the time we were hastening the peace process, but Nixon was so stubborn about public opinion and demonstrators. He simply had a very thick skin with respect to public opinion, and he wasn't going to succumb at any point and give in. And consequently, with Kissinger carrying on these negotiations endlessly, the war simply was delayed much longer than it should have been.
This is Joan Hoff's book, available in paperback from Basic Books. It's called Nixon Reconsidered. We're going to go right to telephone calls and continue the conversation that we've been having here about the life and the presidency of Richard Nixon. Burnsville, Maryland, you are on the air for Joan Hoff.
Yes, good evening.
Hello.
I'd like to know, how worried was President Nixon about having to give a national address about the failing of the moon landing, the astronauts dying out there on the moon?
That's a very good question, because we now know that he prepared a speech in the event that something went wrong with that landing.
Joan Hoff, let me interrupt you to have you give us a little time reference. When was this?
Well, he was, you remember that the moon project was started under Kennedy. And then Nixon inherited it, basically, and consequently, what you find is that as the moonshot was scheduled to take place, it ended up being one that was more dangerous than really the astronauts and others had thought. And so consequently, he did prepare a speech that would have indicated that they had died as patriots, as courageous men, but there was no surety that they would come back. And consequently, he was as concerned as any president would be with a major failure, a technological failure with some kind of NASA space program.
How is this country different for Richard Nixon having served as president?
I think it's very different. I think he's probably the most significant president since the Second World War, that is, for the last half of the 20th century. And consequently, for example, in terms of his domestic policies, they were more progressive, more liberal than any of the presidents to succeed him. And all of both parties and all politicians are now to the right of center of Nixon on domestic reform. His welfare proposal was the most radical ever really announced to the American people. He was the first environmental president, and so he got the environmental program off the ground. He was the president, for example, who declared Earth Day. We normally forget that. His civil rights record is really astounding when you look at it with respect to women, Native Americans, again, all to the left of where affirmative action or civil rights or welfare might be today. So that if you look just at his domestic achievements, he went beyond the New Deal and he went beyond the Great Society. He outspent Johnson's Great Society. He was the last of the big spenders as far as the presidents go. So in
How
terms,
is the country different because of Watergate 25 years later?
I think what Watergate did was a number of things, and maybe just let me say a couple. The thing that I hold against Watergate most was that it allowed for Jimmy Carter to make a bid for the presidency and win when he wouldn't have had a chance as a presidential candidate if it hadn't been for Watergate and his announcement that he was going to run a moral, honest campaign. And it's not that Jimmy Carter was such a bad president, but that he was perceived to be a failure. And what I think that did, it skewed the American political system, if you think about it, because Nixon should have been succeeded by another moderate Republican, leaving the door open for the Democrats to come in 1980. And what happened instead was, because of Carter's perceived failure as a Democratic president, that gave time and room for the right and the Republican Party to get organized and to bring in Ronald Reagan. So I think it really skewed American politics for the last quarter century.
Santa Clara, California, for Joan Hoff.
Much for taking my call. Just to say one last thing, that President...
Caller, did you just call us a few minutes ago?
No, I didn't. I just wanted to make this comment that President Nixon was great because he showed that a poor boy from Whittier could go on to become the leader of the free world, and that America makes that possible. And his training made him equipped for that. The point I want to make on this about him is that in 1971, he tilted in favor of Pakistan. Hello?
Yes, that's true.
He tilted in favor of Pakistan, and that trip later led to the rapprochement with China. Today, Mr. Bush opposed Pakistan and mentioned India, which is a godless country unlike America. And Pakistan is more a Judeo-Christian Islamic country under one God. And I'm wondering how far the Republican Party has come, or is this just the view of Mr. Bush's advisor?
I think at the moment we can only say, caller, that it is probably just the view of Mr. Bush himself. I don't think the Republican Party in general has repudiated the relationship with Pakistan.
Let's take another telephone call, and I do think that was the caller that phoned us earlier. You've had your limit for today, sir. Please don't call back in this program. We're not talking about next year's presidential campaign. We're learning more about the presidency of Richard Nixon. Hagerstown, Indiana. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have a question for the author. I was wondering why Mr. Nixon chose Spiro Agnew in 1968 as his running mate. And
thank you. All right, you have a second question?
Yes, and also if there was any truth to the fact that Nixon wanted to dump Agnew in the 72 election.
Thank you. Joan Hoff, who was Spiro Agnew?
Well, he was considered at the time, and again, it's one of these things we forget because of the Watergate image of Nixon. He was chosen because Nixon thought he was a liberal governor, and indeed he had been a liberal governor of Maryland. And so Nixon, it shows again Nixon's progressive leanings that he would choose Agnew. We don't remember Agnew as a liberal because of the scandal he became involved in, but indeed that was his reputation. And consequently, Nixon favored some of his policies in Maryland and thought that he could help him out in the presidency. And in fact, Agnew has one of the most liberal policies with respect to Native Americans and encouraged Nixon to be liberal with Native American policy while he was vice president and before he was forced, of course, to resign.
Second question was, in 1972, did he consider dumping him from the ticket?
By that time, he'd become enamored with a man who was a Democrat who was to become a Republican, John Connor from Texas. And consequently, he was thinking that it would be better in '72 to have a different running mate, though I don't think he was seriously considering dumping Agnew at that time. But he did want John Connor to succeed him in '76 because by that time Connor had become a Republican.
What you said that there was a scandal with Spiro Agnew. Would you explain what happened to him and when?
Well, it was simply that he, after he became vice president, was still apparently taking kickback money from construction builders and other groups in Maryland. And what's so odd about the situation was that he actually apparently accepted some of this money in the White House. It simply didn't make much sense. And although it's been claimed that Johnson did the same thing while he was in the White House, it certainly was never proven. And so Agnew remains the only vice president who was simply on the take after he had become a member of the White House team, and consequently when it came out, he was forced to resign.
Next telephone call as we talk about Richard Nixon, Yuma, Arizona.
Yes, hello. Thank you for taking my call. I read in Aiken's book a few years ago, and maybe you addressed this earlier, that Stanley Finch, the lieutenant governor of California at the time, was actually offered the vice presidential nomination. Nixon actually said, "It's yours if you want it," and Finch declined.
You mean Robert Finch?
Oh, is it Robert? Yeah,
it's
okay.
Robert Finch, yeah.
The lieutenant governor of California.
Exactly. Again, this gets us into the liberal people that Nixon had around him. He did bring Robert Finch with him to the White House to serve in several different capacities. And it was Finch, for example, who, as head of HEW, actually brought forth the welfare program that Nixon finally endorsed. So that he liked Finch very much. He thought he was a bright young man. And I don't really believe that he seriously thought of him as a vice presidential candidate in his first race, simply because he wasn't that well known outside of California. But he certainly wanted him around him for his liberal views, and he got those liberal views on the welfare program.
Collegedale, Tennessee is next. Caller, go ahead.
Hello?
You're on the air.
Yes, I was trying to figure out why the Nixons left San Clemente when he was after his White House years, why they left San Clemente and moved back to New York, and then why they moved to New Jersey after that.
Well, Nixon had always wanted to have a law career in New York, and in the 60s he did have one there, and he built up his allies within the Republican Party while he was working out of John Mitchell's firm in New York City. He had an affection and a fondness for New York. I don't think Pat Nixon would have moved to New York on her own, but Nixon definitely wanted to go back there because it really was where he thought the action was outside of Washington, D.C. And so he set up in the federal office building in Wall Street, his offices as ex-president, and he stayed there a number of years, then moving and buying a place in Saddle Creek, New Jersey. So that I think it was to accommodate his desire to be on the East Coast, to be sort of at the center of things as far as he could as ex-president in New York City. It offered him more opportunities than did San Clemente in Southern California.
Will you talk about Patricia Nixon in the White House years as First Lady? Did she involve herself in public policy?
No, and most First Ladies really don't. They sometimes take up projects, as you well know, but there have been very few First Ladies to actually get involved in public policy, Eleanor Roosevelt being, of course, the one who comes to mind and who set a record that no other First Lady can really meet. Rosalind Carter also tried, but found it was very difficult because the men around her husband really resented her interference. And Pat Nixon wasn't that kind of First Lady. She was a reluctant First Lady, I think we'd have to say, and she chose to stay behind the scenes and assume a more traditional First Lady role. She was supportive and in public. She made a very good appearance, for example, on his first trip to China. But she wasn't a First Lady who was going to promote herself or her own policies. She came out of a tradition and out of a generation where that really wasn't considered appropriate.
In the late 60s and early 70s, did we take public opinion polls in this country about our First Ladies, as we do today?
Yes.
And how did she fare?
She stacked up fairly well. There was no real resentment of her as there was of her husband. In other words, the kind of liberal intellectual establishment and the liberal politicians, largely Democrats, who opposed Nixon, really didn't take it out on her at all. So she fared fairly well, though she was considered a bit reticent in her approach. But no one really held it against her that she was married to Nixon.
Next telephone call for Joan Huff is from Sacramento.
Thank you. I have two questions real quick. I recall in his domestic policies, he wanted to create super departments within the various departments in the federal government. And I recall that there were like super departments, and he'd have certain, I thought, secretaries reporting to a super secretary. And related to that, I thought that he also instructed certain secretaries of the different departments to impound federal funds, that even though Congress allocated them. Was that true? And I thought that went to the Supreme Court.
Those are two complicated questions. Let me try to deal with them quickly because they're important questions. The one on the it's really with super secretaries. After he won this landslide election, like most presidents who win landslide elections, they get a little arrogant. He and Haldeman not only asked the entire cabinet to resign overnight, which they later admitted was a mistake and said it had a chilling effect, to say the least, on the cabinet. He had been, in his first administration, thwarted to a certain degree by the fact that some of his cabinet members, Walter Hickel, for example, even Finch, didn't perform up to the standard that Nixon had wanted. And so the object of the super secretaries was to put some of the men around him in the White House into positions where cabinet secretaries would be reporting to them and then reporting back to the White House. It was a system, actually, of he wanted a generalist to head these cabinet positions and then have subordinates who were the specialists kept in line by these generalists, and he was thinking about Ehrlichman or Haldeman heading some of the cabinet positions. So that was the super secretary idea. It never went anywhere under Nixon because of Watergate, but if you look at Reagan's organization of the White House and of his cabinet, he actually put into practice a super secretary kind of situation, even though he didn't call it that because of the negative connotations coming from the Nixon administration.
Did he in fact create any new cabinet level departments?
He did, in terms of the environment, yes. He went, because he was such a supporter of the environment, the Council on Environmental Affairs became a cabinet position. Initially, it was simply a cabinet committee, and then it, with the help of Congress and with the encouragement of Congress, it became a cabinet position. And the other question was what now?
I'm going to move on and take another call. Tampa, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was wondering if you could comment on the accuracy of Oliver Stone's depiction of Nixon's character. In my opinion, he characterized him more or less as a paranoid, ill-tempered individual that was haunted by ghosts of the past.
Yeah, it couldn't be a worse portrayal of Nixon if you were Nixon's worst enemy, as I think Stone is. He's a paranoid director, and he makes paranoid movies, and the students that I teach see these movies, and it takes us forever in class to try to counter what is just simply a false portrayal of Nixon, of Watergate. He didn't even quote the smoking gun tape correctly in the movie. He simply cares nothing about facts. He just wants to portray certain paranoid activities and conspiracy activities on the part of the government. So it's just a travesty. It has nothing to do with the Nixon character whatsoever. The portrayal of Pat Nixon is even worse in that movie because it puts her in a kind of aggressive role which she really never played within their marriage.
Oliver Stone's Nixon was a drinker.
Yes.
What about the real Richard Nixon?
Well, that's a good question, too, because he could not hold his liquor. And Ehrlichman told me when I was interviewing him that he had seen Nixon at the 1964 convention and a couple of other public meetings with Republicans where he really did drink too much. It didn't take much because he just didn't hold his liquor well. And Ehrlichman told him that he would not come on board and support him for the '68 election if he were going to continue to do that. And contrary to, again, the stories we hear about Nixon, most of which of the drinking stories come from Kissinger with no corroboration or no factual base as far as I can tell. He simply didn't drink. Even in the famous meetings at these summits when he had to drink the vodka or drink with the Chinese, he was sipping that very, very lightly. He didn't hold his liquor well, but he wasn't someone to be drunk in office. And when we hear with these new release of the tapes, reporters saying he was slurring his words, there's really no proof that he was a heavy drinker or drank in excess at all. But one has to keep in mind that he couldn't drink very much. He simply had no tolerance for alcohol.
Crowley, Texas, for Joan Hoff. Caller, go ahead from Texas, please. Crowley, Texas? Norwalk, Connecticut, are you there?
Hi. I just have a question for you. But first, before I ask the question, I wanted to say thank you, Ms. Hoffa. It's very interesting, but the governor, the Texas governor, the Democrat that you mentioned, is not John Connor. It's John Connolly.
Sorry, I misspoke.
Okay.
All right.
But the question I have for you, Ms. Hoff, is about the Vietnam War. Some years ago, right after Bob Haldeman died, his diaries were published. And I read the edited version of it, but there was a notation in there from March of 1969 that said he and Kissinger and Nixon met and decided in 1969 that they could not end the Vietnam War before 1972, lest the public forget. I was wondering what you thought about that and how accurate is that?
I didn't quite get the
Bob Haldeman.
That he met with Haldeman?
Yes.
Yeah, there's a problem with the Haldeman diaries, and there's a problem really with the Nixon tapes. What one has to do is always check the tapes against the diaries, against the memos, to make sure that what's being said is true. And if it's only one statement in the Haldeman diaries, again, you have to be very suspicious of it, because Haldeman said a lot of things about Nixon or about Nixon's policies that have been shown not to be true when you look at the memos or the documents or even listen to the tapes. And so I have found no indication, hard evidence in the documents at least, that this is a true statement. It's also Haldeman who is the sole author of the fact that Nixon was the mad bomber president who was going to use bombing of in the Vietnam War as a means of getting what he wanted out of the North Vietnamese. And this mad bomber theory has been used by historians and reporters ever since. And the sole source for that is Haldeman, and there's simply no documentation for it.
You've made the case several times that you believe Richard Nixon was a liberal president. Why then was President Johnson, former President Johnson, frustrated with what he saw as the dismantling of his Great Society programs?
Well, I think he just misperceived what Nixon was doing, because take just affirmative action and civil rights. Johnson postponed desegregating the southern schools through HEW 3 times. He postponed the regulations that were supposed to go into effect until the 3rd time they fell due in February of '69 when Nixon was the president. Kennedy and Johnson did not enforce affirmative action. It was Nixon who funded EEOC, the commission that was going to enforce affirmative action. It was Nixon who desegregated the southern schools. If Johnson were unhappy with what Nixon did, it was because Nixon outdid him in terms of that aspect of the Great Society. It was Nixon who really was the first affirmative action president to enforce affirmative action as opposed to talking about it.
Washington, D.C., for Joan Hoff.
Yes, I just read your book and I enjoyed it very much. My question is, in regards to economic policy, which one of Nixon's economic advisors do you think had the biggest impact on his policy and decisions? And second, if the economic situation had been a lot better during 1973, do you think Nixon would have been able to get through the Watergate situation better because his popularity would have been higher?
On the last question, I don't think, no, I don't think the economy would have helped him. What would have helped him had he been a popular president all along? He simply wasn't the kind of person, he didn't have the personality that made him popular like Reagan, so Reagan could walk away from Iran-Contra, or popular like Clinton, which allowed Clinton to walk away really from the impeachment. So that in that sense, I don't think a better economy would have helped him that much. He just didn't have the personal popularity that some of the other presidents have had. In terms of the economy, we go back to John Connolly, who came in as Secretary of the Treasury, and he had these very grandiose ideas. And Nixon liked big ideas. That's why he liked Kissinger around him for these kind of large ideas. It's why he liked Moynihan around him. And he liked Connolly for the same reason. And consequently, he listened to Connolly with respect to his new economic policy, which imposed wage and price controls for the first time since the Second World War, which floated the dollar on the international market, in essence throwing out the Bretton Woods agreements coming out of the Second World War. His economic policy was very dramatic. It wasn't always correct because the wage and price controls led later to greater inflation. And the current floating our dollar on the international market led to currency instability, which is still basically with us. But he had a tremendous impact on the economy, and one of the reasons for his 72 landslide election was that those wage and price controls worked to put a curb on inflation, which was beginning to show its face in the 71 and 72. And he was one of the few presidents to be able to kind of perk up the economy for an election, which helped him then obtain that landslide in 1972.
I want to understand that. Are you saying that it was his personality, that he was not a likable person that caused ultimately his downfall?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. But we have presidents who have personalities that are appealing to popular opinion. Reagan was one, Clinton is another. And those presidents can get away with, in Reagan's case, a much greater violation of the Constitution during Iran-Contra than Watergate ever thought of being. And Clinton could actually be impeached by the House and still get off in the Senate. What happens with presidents who have these types of popular personalities is that it is impossible for investigative reporters or really other kinds of investigators to come up with the goods on them when they are perhaps engaged in either covert or overt activity that is criminal or illegal or unconstitutional. Our system doesn't work well when you have a president who is being shored up by the population in general, and consequently it really thwarts effective investigation of major constitutional or criminal issues. Since Nixon tended not to have that kind of support, more people were willing to leak to the press or leak to official investigators about Watergate affairs.
Newburyport, Massachusetts, last call for Joan Hoff.
Yes, I'd like Ms. Hoff to discuss Nixon's welfare programs, such as the CETA program, Comprehensive Employment Training Act.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All I can really say, again, to reiterate on the welfare program, what he did, even though his welfare program was defeated, that is, the welfare reform was defeated, he immediately turned to other forms of welfare and social services. He shored up food stamps. He did the CETA. He did college grants for students. And what he ended up doing was outspending on human services. On human services. It was the first time in our history since, again, you have to go back to the beginning of the century, when social service spending was greater than defense spending for all of the budgets Nixon was responsible for from 1970 to 1975. His social service spending was simply phenomenal, and he outspent Johnson, I think, overall by something like sevenfold, so that his social service programs, I disagree with what some of you might have heard earlier when Mel Small said that he was going to cut back in his second administration. His budget through 75 shows no cutback on social service spending.
Joan Hoff, at this point we'll have to say goodbye to you. We're about out of satellite time from New York City. Thank you. This is Joan Hoff's book, Nixon Reconsidered, available from Basic Books. Thank you for being part of our program today.
Thank you.
We have more to go here, about 55 minutes left in our conversation about the presidency of Richard Nixon, our 37th president. And as we take our break and invite our two first guests to come back and join us again, I want to tell you that we have all sorts of products available to help you understand more about the history of the American presidents. We've got timelines that sketch out all of the presidents' terms of service in public life. We've got a book about visiting the American presidents' graves, all sorts of products. And during the break, we'll tell you about how you can get some of those. About the life and times of Richard Milhous Nixon, who was our 37th president. This is C-SPAN's American President series, begun in March and will carry through until president number 42, the 41st man because of two Grover Cleveland terms. That'll be Bill Clinton in December. And we invite your telephone calls for this as we discuss Richard Nixon's life. We'll put them on the screen. It's 202-624-1111 if you live in the eastern half of the United States, and 202-624-1115 if you live in the western half of the U.S. We've got two guests who are joining us for a final hour. John Taylor, who is the executive director of the Nixon Library. And how many acres do you have here?
We have 9 acres of the original 12.5-acre Frank Nixon lemon farm.
And what's the entire campus comprised of?
Comprised of lovely grounds that were landscaped under the direction of Mrs. Nixon. The President's restored birthplace, which he insisted we not turn around and have faced the library since it had stood all those years without being moved. An archive of about 3,000 or 4,000 linear feet of pre- and post-presidential documents. The White House papers are, according to government edict, remaining in Washington for the time being. And a museum of about 14,000 square feet about the life and times of Richard Nixon, as well as a gift shop and a website, www.nixonlibrary.org.
Our second guest with us for most of our program today, and we appreciate him being here from Wayne State University near Detroit, is Melvin Small. This is his book. It is called The Presidency of Richard Nixon, just come out in September. And he looks at the Nixon presidency in terms of major issues that he faced during his White House years. We welcome your calls. We'll go to them in just a couple minutes. While we're talking about calls, I have another telephone number that I'd like to give you, and that's the number for teachers. One of the most important things we have been doing in this series is making as much of this material as available as possible to those of you who teach school so that young people can learn about the life and legacies of the 41 men who served in the White House. Here's the telephone number, 202-626-4858. 202-626-4858. And if you call tonight on this Friday late afternoon, early evening, there are folks standing by who can take your telephone call and tell you more about the free teaching materials we'll put in your hands so that you can teach about the American presidents. There's another way you can get the information. That's on the internet. It's cspan.org/classroom. During each of our segments, we've talked to a teacher in the classroom, and you're going to meet by telephone Donna Schlamp, who is just retired from the Richard Nixon Elementary School in Hiawatha, Iowa. How did the school come to be named after Richard Nixon?
Well, the Cedar Rapids Community Schools has had a tradition of naming a vast majority of their schools after presidents. And Nixon School was opened in 1970 when President Nixon was president.
During the Watergate years, what was it like having a school named after Richard Nixon?
Well, I wasn't at the school in those years, coming later in the 70s, but I understand that there were some people that were concerned about that. But by that time, the school had been established, and they felt it was doing a great job, and it didn't seem to be an issue, only with a few people.
How did you teach young people about Richard Nixon?
Well, I was going back to 1995 when we celebrated our 25th anniversary. We spent a vast amount of time going over the life of President Nixon and making them aware of the problems with Watergate, but also all of the great issues that he took care of while he was president. We also talked to him about his childhood. We were very fortunate in that his younger brother, Ed Nixon, was able to come and spend a day with us when we celebrated the 25th anniversary. It was a wonderful experience.
What was that like? What did he have to tell the students?
Oh, he had 3 wonderful stories, all about 9-year-olds. He told about how President Nixon, when he was 9 years old, read and read and read. That's what his mother, Hannah, told him. And then he told the story about when he was 9 years old. His brother, Richard, after he graduated from law school, decided he needed a new car. And he drove to Michigan to get it and took his 9-year-old younger brother along with him. It was a great adventure. They came back, got in the car, and Richard said to Edward, "Oh, you're going to do the maps." Edward said that his brother always was a teacher, even though you didn't know he was a teacher. And they drove back to California. And Richard Nixon said to his brother, "If you can find a very straight stretch of road without much traffic on it, I'll let you drive. And he did. Who would believe that? And then we had another story that Ed Nixon told about his young daughter going and writing the president right after the election and said, "We're so glad that you won the election. When can we come and visit the White House?" So eventually they got to go to the White House. And President Nixon took the whole family around showing them all the rooms. And he mentioned that the black telephones were wonderful. He said, all you have to do is pick up a black telephone, tell them who you are and where you are and what you want. So Beth could not sleep that evening. The poor girl had been so excited. So she was up in the solarium on the top floor, decided she needed a coat. She picked up the telephone, told them what she wanted, and the poor man that had to bring it to her had to get on his clothes, his white gloves, and brought the Coke up on the silver tray. The children just enjoyed those stories so much because it made the Nixon family seem so human.
If you didn't have the opportunity to bring in your teacher, and you don't have the opportunity to bring in someone who's related to a president to talk about them, how would you teach about presidents? How would you bring it alive for students?
Well, we had children in the fourth grade do a whole lot of research, and they taught the rest of the children. And all the grades went through it, and they adapted it for each grade level, and it worked very, very well.
Well, thank you for sharing the stories of Ed Nixon's visit to the Richard Nixon Elementary School in Hiawatha, Iowa. Our guest by phone, Donna Schlump, is now retired, but for 19 years she worked at Nixon Elementary. And thanks for telling us about the school's 25th anniversary and the connection with the Nixon family.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me give you the phone number for teachers one last time, 202-626-4858, and that will get you teaching materials about the American presidents. Melvin Small, you teach young people who weren't even born when Richard Nixon was president. What are the questions they usually have about him?
A lot of the questions have to do with Bill Clinton, as you might imagine, because they lived through a similar experience. And they say, well, how do they compare? How do you compare the resignation and almost impeachment and the impeachment of Clinton? And that most interests them right now, and really brought Nixon back into the headlines. Also, interestingly, you may remember that a couple of months ago when the women's soccer team won their tournament, all of a sudden Richard Nixon's picture was on the TV screens. And how come? It was because he had signed into law Title IX, which guaranteed equal treatment for women in higher education, which led to a great takeoff in women's collegiate athletics.
John Taylor, we've been mentioning a few names. How about other Nixon White House alumni who are prominent in American life today, whose names haven't been mentioned?
Well, Henry Kissinger remains one of the foremost authorities on international affairs, and say what you will about the dynamics inside that very complex and combustible place, the Nixon White House during that long grinding war. It was probably the most fruitful public policy partnership in American life since FDR and Henry Hopkins, and I think probably they will be remembered as a team. There are a lot of alumni such as Brent Scowcroft, who was President Bush's national security advisor, who was part of the Nixon as well as the Ford administration team, having served in the same post under President Ford. President Bush himself began his career as a congressman from Texas with Richard Nixon's support. He also supported Congressman Bush's unsuccessful bid for Senate, sent him to China as United States' first representative to the People's Republic of China prior to the appointment of a formal ambassador. Interestingly, President Bush and General Scowcroft will both be honored here at the Nixon Library on the 11th of January, receiving our second Victory of Freedom Award, which is something the Nixon Board of Directors and Nixon family gives to someone who's contributed to the end of the Cold War, which all of our presidents, as a continuum, did.
Melvin Small, someone who's running for president this year, is also connected with the Nixon administration. Pat Buchanan, what did he do?
Pat Buchanan was a pugnacious journalist who was one of the first people Nixon hired in his exile in New York City between '62 and '68. Buchanan became his most prominent right-wing speechwriter. He had quite an array of speechwriters, from right to center to kind of left liberal, and Buchanan was the one who was the master of alliteration. I think he's responsible for nattering nabobs and negativism and the like. hard-hitting conservative who wrote a book about the Nixon administration after serving, and he was disappointed that it wasn't conservative, that it was middle of the road, that it was not what Nixon had promised, he suggested in 1968.
Back to calls. Evanston, Illinois. Sorry, Culver City, California. Go ahead, please.
Hi. Did Nixon ever discuss the Blacklist group? And what were his feelings toward the men and women he helped destroy financially and psychologically? Thank you.
That's a reference to the blacklist of the 1940s and early 50s, went on really into about 1960 or so, when Americans who may have been communists or may have been fellow travelers or may have been related to someone who might have been a left-wing liberal sometimes ended up losing their jobs, in the thousands, in the tens of thousands, really. Richard Nixon was not responsible for that kind of activity. Earlier, correctly, John pointed out that he was critical of the tactics used by Joe McCarthy and his followers. It is true, of course, that Richard Nixon and people in his party rarely, if ever, spoke out about the injustices that had been done to scores and scores of Americans during that dark period of the Cold War.
Evanston, Illinois. Go ahead, please. Evanston, you there? All right, let's move on, please, to Salisbury, Maryland. Salisbury, go ahead, please.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to say I enjoy your show, and I wanted to ask about Nixon's environmentalism. You guys seem to be making a lot of it, but all my teachers said that he was really anti-environment. What about McLaughlin and Ben Stein, also as former alumni? Thank you. I'll listen.
The political dynamics of Richard Nixon's domestic agenda are fascinating. Richard Nixon was raised in this little house and later in Whittier, had family members die of cancer without sufficient health insurance. As Joan pointed out, he put forward national health insurance and was not the kind of a Republican who was at war with the federal government. He was persuaded by John Ehrlichman and others on the domestic policy staff to create the Environmental Protection Agency because he believed there was a case to be made for a federal agency which would protect the environment without interfering fundamentally with the engines of economic growth. So he was a moderate environmentalist, persuaded to embrace the agenda, and who sometimes was disturbed by the extent to which he was in touch with his conservative critics as a result of these policies. So his heart sometimes led him to the left and center. His political head sometimes dragged him back to the right. It was a constant dynamic with Nixon's domestic affairs. But he did not create the EPA because a gun was held to his head. He created it because it was the right thing to do.
I think I'll get a little conflict and disagree a little bit here. Nixon privately referred to environmentalism as, quote, crap. And he also said that if it comes down between jobs and smoke, we take jobs. The reason why he became such an environmentalist, and he did sign off on major environmental legislation, is not only because of John Ehrlichman, because the Democrats, controlled Congress, were sending up to him even more extreme, from his perspective, liberal environmentalism. And his chief rival for the '72 campaign, who ended up not running finally, was Senator Muskie. And Senator Muskie's main claim to fame was being an ardent environmentalist. So he would tell his domestic advisors, look, don't get me in trouble with the environmentalists because I have to at least get close to Muskie on this issue because it's going to be a big issue in 1972. The first Earth Day was in 1969. The environmentalists, interestingly, chose by mistake, perhaps, Lenin's birthday, demonstrating that it was obviously an anti-capitalist plot.
You referenced the '72 campaign. Who was his Democratic rival?
His Democratic rival was George McGovern, a PhD in history, who lost every state except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. In 1973, bumper stickers began to appear around the United States saying, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts."
What was the issue of the 1972 campaign?
Well, the '72 campaign, this really has a lot to do with Watergate and dirty tricks during the campaign. The Nixon administration would prefer not to have run against Muskie or even Hubert Humphrey. And they did a lot to try to make McGovern their candidate. Now, McGovern won fair and square in good measure because of the 1960, now I'm getting complicated, the six-state Democratic Convention, which led to a reform in the convention rules which overrepresented the left and liberals at the Democratic Convention, and McGovern was a left liberal. He certainly wasn't the radical painted by the Republicans at the time, but they painted him to the radical corner. He was announced as the candidate of the 3 A's, which was abortion, acid, dope, and appeasement. And there might have been a fourth also, amnesty. Appeasement was, he suggested at one point, he made a mistake, as most presidential candidates do, as we've seen in the last few months. He said, if he had to bring an end to the war in Vietnam, he'd go on his knees to Hanoi, i.e. he was an appeaser. And he was dead. He ran an inept campaign, and Nixon ran a Rose Garden campaign. The journalist had only one game in town, which was following poor old George, our PhD in history.
John Taylor, that caller asked about John McLaughlin and Ben Stein.
John McLaughlin was brought into the Nixon administration as part of the speechwriting shop. He was then an ordained Catholic minister, later leaving the church, and went on to establish the McLaughlin Group and to appear on television as a contentious, pugnacious commentator. Ben Stein, also part of Ray Price's speechwriting shop in the White House, the longest-haired member of the Nixon White House staff for a period of time, the dedicated son of Council of Economic Advisors Chairman Herb Stein, who recently passed away, now having been brought into Hollywood by John Hughes, the director, the star of Ben Stein's Money, but a loyal Nixonite to the end and an astonishingly good friend of President Nixon.
San Francisco, you're next on Richard Nixon.
Yes, my question to the panelists is regarding Spiro Agnew, and I find that with the Watergate controversy and the reactions, it's commonly overlooked at the seriousness of Agnew's crimes and also his departure from the White House. I would be interested in taking your comments on that.
The Vice President accepted payments according to previously arranged deals with Maryland contractors while in the White House. It was the kind of venality of a garden variety nature, sort of East Coast machine type corruption that did not characterize Watergate. Watergate was not about money, in spite of, in my view, unjust charges against President Nixon regarding his income taxes. Was not a matter of venality. It was entirely a matter of passions and excesses that had to do with steps taken to counteract America's war with itself over the war in Vietnam. What the Agnew matter did was bring into Watergate, to which it was technically unrelated, a disgraceful element of venality. And I don't take away in any way from Agnew's accomplishments as a Republican, a progressive government in Maryland, but it was politically devastating and completely separate from anything that characterized Watergate.
We're going to return to the inside of the library and introduce you to Susan Nolte, who is archivist for the Richard Nixon Library and Museum. And as we do that, John Taylor, explain once again what papers you have here and what you do not have.
Susan is the custodian of about 3/5 of Richard Nixon's pre-presidential records, the rest having been deeded to the National Archives under a deed which was invalidated for tax purposes, but which the National Archives decided was just fine for them. So the archives kept the records, but Susan looks after the 3/5 that remain, as well as all of President Nixon's post-presidential records. She was trained at the Huntington Library in Pasadena, which is one of the finest private archives in the world. She is the best in the business.
Susan Nolte, President Nixon was alive for 4 years after his library opened. How interested was he in the part of the shop that you work in?
He was very interested in the archives, and he said to me that what he wanted us to do here was to make everything available for people so that they could learn the entire, or study the entire record for the sake of history.
What do you have to show our audience today?
Well, archives have many, many thousands of documents, but some of them have wonderful stories associated with them, and I wanted to share with you some of those stories. Charles Rind, who is an eminent jurist and has recently written an autobiography. He was a student at Duke University Law School when Richard Nixon was there. But while he was at Duke, he had developed a bone infection from blood poison. So he spent much of his time in the infirmary. And the one person who came to see him was Richard Nixon, and he brought with him his lecture notes, which were famous on campus for being so thorough. So for all of you students who are watching this, you may want to take a look at these notes to see how it may be done properly, because Ryan did very well in his studies at Duke, largely because of himself, but also with the help of his fellow student, who later became President of the United States. This is one of the law books, that one of 10 that are extant, that Richard Nixon filled out with lecture notes when he went to Duke. This is on the famous Marbury versus Madison case, which I think many of the students who are listening have to study when they're going to school. But you see how how full they are, and then he continues over here, and he continues taking notes here.
What's the difference between what he wrote up the sides as opposed to the notes he took in the correct direction?
I think these are precedents, and this is formal lecture. So you have, this is a document which is excellent as an example to show how a document can be used in multiple ways. This is not only a good example of his student life and his dedication to study, it is also an excellent resource for the study of how law was taught at Duke in the 1930s. And there are 10 of these books.
Susan Nolte, let's take a call and we'll come back. Our time is short. We'll look at one more item that you have for our audience. Next is North Royalton, Ohio.
Good evening. I wonder if you'd be kind enough to discuss Watergate. You've alluded to it, but I haven't heard a good discussion.
Watergate would be in one of the other sections. We haven't talked about it in the archive section. And it wouldn't be something that we would be able to talk about because the presidential papers are, as Mr. Taylor indicated, at the National Archives, so they're not in our collection.
As soon as we finish with Susan Nolte, we will come back and talk specifically about Watergate and the final years of the Nixon presidency. Portland, Oregon.
Thank you for taking my call. Love the show. I got a couple questions. First of all, if it was not for Watergate, with Richard Nixon's what I think was a expertise in foreign policy, do you think he would have played a very significant role for his predecessors in regards to advising them, especially in regards to the Soviet Union, the Middle East? And my other question also was, as a lifelong Democrat, I used to really despise Richard Nixon, but I've tried to understand him over the years. I've read more and more about him. And in my opinion, I really think even though Watergate was a smear on his presidency, that he will be regarded as a great president. I'll take your comments off the air. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. John Taylor, in fact, he did advise presidents on foreign policy.
Each of his successors as president, and most remarkably, he had a very fruitful intellectual synergy with Bill Clinton. Beginning in 1991, Richard Nixon, who had spent his life inveighing against Soviet communism, began to make a series of annual trips to the Soviet Union and then to Russia, trips that were organized by the now president of the Nixon Center, Dimitri Simes, because he believed it was vitally important for the United States to identify itself with pro-freedom forces in the deteriorating Marxist-Leninist regime of Mikhail Gorbachev. And when President Clinton gave a eulogy for President Nixon here in April of 1994, he said some of the best advice he'd gotten on Russian relations he had gotten from former President Nixon.
I should point out there is an interesting political footnote to this. By the time that George Bush became president, Richard Nixon had reached the status of being a respected elder statesperson. When he didn't approve of the way Bush was moving on the Soviet Union, he said, I'm going to write an article in the New York Times op-ed piece unless you do such and such and let me speak such and such. And in fact, blackmail is a strong word, but Bush did do what Nixon suggested. Now, flash forward to Bill Clinton. Same thing happens. First, in March of 1993, Nixon said, using as an intermediary Dick Morris, who we now know for that Dick Morris, says, I'm going to write an op-ed article that's critical of your foreign policy in the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. If you invite me to the White House for a meeting, the op-ed article could be not critical. And in fact, Nixon was invited to the White House, talked to Clinton for a while. For a few months, they enjoyed something of a relationship, exchanging ideas. After a while, Nixon, before his death, had become quite disappointed with Bill Clinton's foreign policy.
Susan Nolte, let's return to you and one other item of your large collection there that you'd like to show our audience.
Well, one of a series that we'd like to show. This is a letter. This is a special letter because we know from the thank you note that accompanied it and from the creases, if you note the creases in the back, that this was a letter which was actually carried by Richard Nixon during the 1952 campaign. He received it by hand from a lady in Oklahoma during a visit there. She was the mother. She was a mother who had brought her family up during the Depression years, the New Deal years, and one of the themes of the 52 campaign was the Democratic Party said, you've never had it so good. It was the prosperity theme. But the Republicans challenged this, saying that it was a war economy that had brought the prosperity. And this is what this lady says in her letter. And she gives him specifics. And so what he has done with this, he kept it. And when he went out to audiences, he would take the letter and he would read sections of it. And here you see him at an event that followed the Oklahoma visit. So later on in the campaign, he thanked her very much for it and has given us the clue that this is exactly what he did. So he really did pay attention to the letters that he received. We have found this constantly in the correspondence. That's one of the richnesses of the correspondence. He kept his constituent mail and mail he received. So it's rich in popular history as well as in political history.
Who may access your archives?
The archives are accessible to scholars and to researchers. They are original source centers. And for a good scholar, well, for example, Erwin Gelman, who has just written The Contender, has spent 5 years going through about 50,000 documents here, not to mention thousands of documents at Laguna Niguel and other collections around the country. A scholar will sit here for year upon year going through this to create a book, to reach conclusions, and to put this all together for the public so that they can gain from his research. And we're here to make it possible for scholars to do just that. It saves the public a lot of time.
Susan Nolte, thank you very much for showing us. I know you've got lots more, but our time is evaporating, so we appreciate what you have given us a little taste of this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Let me turn to Melvin Small to ask, we're going to take a couple of minutes here away from calls and have you explain, presume it's a young person who wasn't alive, what was Watergate?
It's a good question. Watergate was not the break-in that took place on June 17th, 1972, when 5 people working for the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee looking for, and for the time being we'll leave out what they were looking for because it's quite controversial why, but some kind of political intelligence. When word leaked out through the activities of Woodward and Bernstein, the 2 young investigative reporters for the Washington Post, the Nixon administration decided to contain this story, in part because these people had been connected to people higher up than themselves in the Committee to Re-elect the President, and maybe, it turns out probably likely, John Mitchell, the former Attorney General, who had resigned being Attorney General to become the head of the Committee to Re-elect the President. In the cover-up of this activity, the Nixon administration participated in suborning perjury, we can find evidence of that, in using investigative agencies of the federal government to claim national security reasons for not doing any follow-ups. Now, all these things are still a pretty small story about the break-in at Watergate. What happened was, very much like the Whitewater affair with Bill Clinton, one small issue leads to a variety of others. And in Nixon's case, there were all sorts of other, as I mentioned earlier, John Mitchell referred to White House horrors, dealing with wiretapping, illegal wiretapping, dealing with more than just dirty tricks during the campaign of '72. The enemies list were referred to as not illegal, but a whole series of illegal and extra-legal activities, which went far beyond the break-in and in many ways presented the gravest constitutional crisis in American history since the Civil War. Now, saying that, because that really relates to the question about where do we evaluate President Nixon. In 1996, a group of historians and political scientists and some journalists evaluated him dead last. And it was obvious because of Watergate and the associated Watergate crimes and misdemeanors. I use an example of Franklin Roosevelt, who most people think is one of the great presidents in history. Suppose it turned out in 1945 that we discovered that Franklin Roosevelt had been illegally using the FBI to pursue his enemies in Congress, which he did in 1939, 40, and 41. Or suppose it turned out, this didn't quite happen, that he had covered up or lied about the affairs he was having with his secretary and another old flame he had from the 1920s, from that period. Would we then, had this all come out, and had in fact Roosevelt either been impeached or had resigned, would we then rank Roosevelt the worst president in American history? I don't think so, and this is where we have a problem with Watergate. Should it overshadow all the other things that President Nixon did? Now, of course, Watergate began not in '72, but it began in '69. It began perhaps for the first time when Nixon came to office with a $2 million slush fund left over from his previous campaign, which he began using for internal dirty tricks, hiring investigators, and then, of course, we talked about the wiretapping involving the bombing of Cambodia.
What was the final year like?
The final year was one shock after another, as Nixon had to backtrack, either giving up tapes or giving up transcripts, or admitting to a variety of things that he had done which he claimed were not illegal or extra-legal. And every couple of months there was another blow. And in many ways, when you look back now, even if you want to argue that it was the most serious crisis in our government since the Civil War, you can't help feeling sorry for the predicament that he got himself into after, absent Watergate White House horrors, after a rather remarkable 4 years.
Did the business of government continue in the final year?
That's a very good question. The domestic policy of the Nixon administration all but disappeared somewhere in the middle of 1973. And in foreign policy, even during the Yom Kippur War, when we had our second greatest nuclear crisis, when Henry Kissinger, in effect, ordered an alert, Nixon was kind of out of the loop. Although Alexander Haig disagrees, I interviewed him on this issue. Most historians think that Nixon was so taken up with what was going on domestically, this is the time when he fired his independent prosecutor, that even in foreign policy, he may have gone to some trips. He went to the summit in Moscow in 1974, and in the Moscow summit there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of people greeted him on the streets in the summer, where he got a much better reception, obviously, than he was getting in the United States at the time.
We have a clip from President Nixon's decision to resign. Let's listen.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
John Taylor, the executive director of the Richard Nixon Library. How did Mr. Nixon himself come to view Watergate?
He viewed it always as a political struggle rather than a moral one. He understood the passions that were abroad in the land as a result of Watergate, Vietnam rather, that led to Watergate. He was aware of the passions that he excited among friends and critics alike. He was never particularly bitter. He was always a realist about Watergate. He talked about it some, he wrote about it some, and then he sort of put it in a compartment of his consciousness so that it wouldn't distract him from the work he wanted to do in the last 19 years of his life. I would say about Watergate, at the risk of being reductionist, it's a complicated subject. He didn't order the Watergate break-in. There's no hint in the new tapes that he was aware of the payment of hush money as opposed to expenses money for Watergate burglars until the spring of 1973. He did not order the Ellsberg break-in. The income tax charges are a little bit overwrought. The wiretaps were not anywhere near as numerous as under prior administrations and arguably legal. The main problem with Watergate was the inability of the president to get a handle on what was going on. And if you read the new tapes, even as incompletely transcribed by University of Wisconsin Professor Stanley Cutler and driven by Professor Cutler through a sort of a get Nixon analytical mentality, he cannot put his finger on it. And part of it is because his aides are so deeply involved in it. Dr. Small argues in his book, I think with some justification, that Watergate's sort of ultimate Genesis act was the Ellsberg break-in, which John Ehrlichman had approved, and he knew it. And if you read the tapes, you see over and over again both John Dean and later John Ehrlichman attempting to get the president to think that the problem was his distracted friend John Mitchell. The president therefore spent 6 months trying to get John Mitchell to own up, which was a track he had been put down by people who were attempting to cover up for themselves. He was confused about it, and some people would say, well, he just should have fired them all and gotten to the bottom of it. These were his friends, these were his colleagues, these were his indispensable colleagues in many cases, and it was difficult for him to find out what had really happened. It doesn't mean he didn't mismanage it. It doesn't mean he didn't do some things he shouldn't have done. But the complete and the accurate and the balanced story of Watergate is yet to be told.
We have only 6 minutes left. Let's return to telephone calls. Marietta, Georgia.
Good evening. There's been much speculation tonight, even offered by the late president himself in a television interview he recorded in 1983, that if there had not been a Vietnam War, perhaps there would not have been a Watergate affair. My question is this: if there had not been a Vietnam War, would there have been a President Nixon? Would Nixon have been elected in 1968 at a time of peace?
That's a very good question. When Lyndon Johnson on March 31st, 1968 said he wasn't going to run for the presidency, it shocked quite a few people, including Richard Nixon, who was surprised. Without the Vietnam War, which of course forced Lyndon Johnson to say he wasn't going to run, Johnson was riding pretty high. The economy was still pretty good. It doesn't go south until about 1969. He had a Democratic Congress. The country was still majority Democratic, at least in terms of registration. There's no doubt that Lyndon Johnson would have been reelected, absent the Vietnam War. Of course, but who knows, there would have been something else perhaps other than the Vietnam War.
Next is, John, let me take a call here. Hemet, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I was wondering if there are any of the Nixon records that are still sealed. And if they are sealed, is there a possibility that we, as a public, would get a chance to, see them someday? And also, are there any other presidents' records that are still sealed?
Hello, Hemet neighbor. The Nixon tapes are being opened in enormous chunks, 400 or 500 hours at a time, basically annually. The United States government has decided that certain portions, both of written records and of tape records, ought to be sealed for national security purposes. It's the view of the Nixon estate that it's about a bunch of dead communists, and as much of it as they can open, we're in favor of opening. And in fact, under the Clinton administration, additional efforts have been made by archivists to open national security records. While we're doing what-ifs, what if Richard Nixon had been elected instead of John F. Kennedy in 1960? Some historians trace our initial 60s involvement in Vietnam to Kennedy's concern that Khrushchev was underestimating him, in part because the Vienna summit in 1962 had gone so poorly. There are many who believe, I among them, that Richard Nixon would not have gotten involved in Vietnam in the way that both Kennedy and Johnson did. So you can take the what-if battle all the way back to 1960 and do away with Vietnam.
I think I prefer to go back to 54, when Dwight Eisenhower was thinking about intervening to save the French in Vietnam. And Richard Nixon was the hawk who wanted the intervention, and Eisenhower said no at that point. So I'm not quite certain about Nixon's Vietnam policy in 1961-62.
Richard Nixon and Patricia Nixon are buried here on the grounds of the Richard Nixon Library. How did Richard Nixon die?
President Nixon died a few days after returning from the fourth of his annual trips to Moscow. He had been, the day he fell ill with a stroke in April of 1994, marking the page proofs of what would be his last book, published posthumously, called Beyond Peace. He had been concerned as an older man about losing his faculties. It was something that preoccupied him greatly. He enjoyed his intellectual life. It was probably the center of his being. And he worried that he would linger. I don't want to say it's a blessing that he died as he did, because it was a tragedy for his family and I believe for a country he was continuing to serve. But he did die at the top of his form, having made an extraordinary hour-and-a-half-long speech to the first ever gathering of the Nixon Center across from the White House at Jackson Place just a few days before he got sick. He lingered for about 4 days, passed away, and was brought to Yorba Linda by Julie Eisenhower, Tricia Cox, and other members of their family to be laid to rest next to his First Lady, who had been buried here the previous June.
They both lived to the same age.
They both lived almost exactly the same age. That's an interesting observation. He lived about 9 or 10 months after she did.
Helena, Montana. You're going to be our last caller on Richard Nixon.
Well, thank you for taking my call. I have visited the Nixon birthplace in center there at Yorba Linda, and I would recommend it to anyone. It's a very good portrayal of his life, and well done. The thing that I was, and maybe as a result of having visited there, when I was watching this Clinton impeachment thing unfold last year at this time and into January, I was thinking, maybe Nixon was premature in resigning. Maybe he could have ridden the thing out. If he would have seen, I'm sure that if he would have seen the experience that we all saw last year, he might have thought better about hanging in there. What do you think?
Thanks very much.
I don't think so. When President Nixon decided to resign, he realized that he had at most 10 or 15 votes in the Senate, and there was still some material to be released. When Bill Clinton was facing the same situation, he calculated pretty carefully that he was not going to be convicted by the Senate. One of the important issues, and we saw Nixon's resignation speech for him, and also for Bill Clinton, has to do with pension and what happens to an ex-president. Had Nixon not resigned and had he been thrown out of office, he would have lost his pension and he would have lost all those perks that go with being an ex-president. And he, like Bill Clinton, doesn't have a hell of a lot of money.
Gentlemen, our time is just about out. In closing, let's set the stage for the next presidency, Gerald Ford. How did Richard Nixon leave the country in 1974?
He left the country in economic difficulty, not as a result of his own policies, but in part because of the Arab oil embargo and a recession. He left the world a peaceful and more stable place, and left a model in his own life of combining the reconciling efforts of a peacemaker with the pragmatic skills of a politician.
Same question, Melvin Small.
The country was torn apart by the Watergate affair. And so that all the things that John is talking about now are the kinds of things that historians and some commentators talked about later on. We were in a mess, and that's when Gerald Ford said our long national nightmare is over. It was a nightmare.
Gentlemen, thank you. Especially thanks to you, John Taylor, for opening up the Richard Nixon Library to C-SPAN today. To Melvin Small for traveling from Detroit to be with us. Joan Hoff joining us from New York City. And to all the folks who work here for their assistance in letting us bring on our massive equipment for this program. To you, our viewers, thank you very much for your questions, which always make these programs work. Next week, Gerald Ford. Thank you from Yorba Linda, California.